Welcome, and thank you for being here tonight, wherever you are, however the day treated you, whatever thoughts are still moving through your mind. You are safe now, and there is nowhere else you need to be. Tonight, as you settle in and allow your body to grow still against whatever softness is holding you, we are going to spend some time together in a quiet and unhurried way, moving through a small collection of stories that have no urgency, no demands, and no need for your full attention. If you like, take a slow breath now, and let your shoulders drop a little, and let the weight of the day begin to leave you. We have time. There is no rush at all. What you will hear tonight are real stories, or as real as any story can be when shared anonymously, drawn from the quiet corners of Japanese internet forums where ordinary people have, for many years, written about the small and sometimes tender and sometimes difficult moments of their lives, their families, their co-workers, their neighbors, their own private confusions and small kindnesses and unexpected sorrows. These stories have been translated carefully into English and retold in a slow and gentle way, meant for listening in the dark, meant for ears that are already beginning to soften toward sleep. Tonight there are 6 stories, each one taking its own unhurried time, each one about people who are very ordinary in the way that most people are ordinary, navigating the quiet complexity of living alongside other people. You do not need to follow every detail, and you do not need to remember anything you hear. If a story carries you somewhere soft and distant and you find yourself drifting before it ends, that is exactly what is meant to happen, and there is nothing at all to hold you back from letting that happen now or at any point along the way. The narration you will hear is offered with the help of AI, shaped to be calm and even and easy on the ears, designed to carry you gently rather than pull you forward. There are no sudden changes, no music that startles, no voices raised above this steady and unhurried tone. Dim the lights if you haven't already, or close your eyes if they are not already closed, and allow your breathing to find its own natural rhythm, slow and easy, in and out, soft and familiar. We will move through these 6 stories together, and you are welcome to stay with them as long or as briefly as suits you tonight. Let's begin. The story belongs to a young man who asked, from the very beginning, that you receive it as gently as it was given, not as something to be measured or argued against, but as a thing that happened to him, quietly and completely, in the heavy August heat of a countryside he had loved since childhood. He had come to the mountains of his mother's hometown not entirely by choice, but by the soft, persistent obligation that loss creates, the kind that draws families back to old houses and older roads and the smell of tatami that has been laid down on wooden floors for decades before any of them were born. His grandfather, his Ji-chan, the patient and unhurried old man who had been the first person to ever take him seriously as a small child, had died some weeks earlier, and the family had gathered at the ancestral house for the 49th day ceremony, the Shijukunichi, the Buddhist rite of passage in which a soul is believed to find its final resting place. It was the kind of day that arrives in rural Japan in August like something solid and unmoving, the heat settling over the valley from a white, hazy sky, the air carrying the low, continuous singing of cicadas from the cryptomeria trees on the hillsides, the smell of incense already rising from within the house before anyone had crossed the threshold. The old house itself held the particular stillness of a place that has absorbed many years, the dark wooden beams overhead worn smooth, the tatami in the main room faded at the edges where sunlight had reached it morning after morning for 30 years, the small altar set up near the window with the grandfather's photograph looking out at something beyond the room. The relatives had gathered on flat cushions in the low-ceilinged rooms, pouring tea for one another, speaking in the careful murmurs appropriate to the occasion, and for a time the young man had sat among them, accepting what was offered, accepting the gentle and well-meaning intrusions that grief seems to invite, the aunt who asked whether he had found stable employment, the uncle who wanted to know whether there was a young woman in his life, with the earnest curiosity of someone who had long since forgotten what it felt like to be 22 and uncertain about everything. He answered as patiently as he could manage, keeping his voice even, his posture correct, because that was what his grandfather's house seemed to ask of him, and because he respected the people gathered there even when the accumulated weight of their questions made the air feel a little thicker than it already was in the August heat. but after a while the heat and the questions and the particular loneliness that can settle over a person in a room full of people who are each grieving in their own slightly different way, all of it had become too close, and he found himself thinking, very clearly and without guilt, that what he needed was an hour alone somewhere that no one would ask him anything at all. He knew exactly where he wanted to go, because his grandfather had shown it to him when he was very small, on one of the long summer visits that had filled his childhood with the particular texture of rural life, the sound of frogs in the irrigation channels at dusk, the cold shock of a mountain stream, the feeling of being somewhere the modern world had not yet entirely reached. The place was a small clearing, perhaps a 10 or 12-minute walk from the old house along a road that was really more of a wide path, shaded by trees whose roots had long since lifted the edges of the pavement into gentle, familiar ridges, the kind of road navigable only by someone who already knew it. It was not a park in any formal sense. There were no swings, no carefully painted equipment, no sign pointing to it from the main road, only a pair of weathered wooden benches and a low table of the same worn timber, set in a space where the trees happened to open just enough to allow a tilted column of afternoon light. On three sides the undergrowth was dense and old, bamboo grass and mountain shrubs pressing close and green, and the trees were tall enough that even on the hottest days the clearing remained in shade for most of the afternoon, and a slow, exploratory wind moved through it regularly, as though the landscape were breathing in a long, unhurried rhythm. He settled on the bench nearest the table and let himself become still for the first time that day, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his eyes half closed against the green filtered light, his shoulders finally releasing the tension they had been carrying since that morning's ceremony. He listened to the cicadas, which were very loud in this particular hollow between the trees, their sound rising and falling in the way it does in the deep Japanese summer, that particular song which is both the sound of heat itself and the sound of something counting down, and he listened also to the occasional rustling movement of leaves overhead, and to nothing else. For a long time he simply existed there in the way that grief sometimes permits when it is not being managed or performed, not thinking in any particular direction, but allowing the memories to arrive on their own terms, without being summoned, without being organized into anything useful. His grandfather's hands came to him first, the broad, dry palms of a man who had worked with them for most of his life, and then the particular way the old man had laughed, head tilting back slightly, and then the summer when the young man was perhaps 7 years old and his Ji-chan had spent an entire afternoon teaching him to catch crayfish in the cold stream behind the vegetable garden, patient and unhurried as he was in everything. He found himself thinking that places hold on to people in some way that is not quite visible and not quite gone, that the clearing itself remembered his grandfather too, that the bench beneath him had felt the old man's weight more mornings and more summers than he would ever be able to count, and that sitting here was, in its quiet fashion, a form of continuity with something that had seemed to stop. At some point, without planning to, he began to cry, not with any sound that would have carried beyond the trees, but in the small, helpless way that grief moves through a person who has been holding it at bay all day in a room full of relatives, the kind of crying that is more like a tide going out than anything dramatic. He sat with it until the feeling passed into something calmer, a tiredness that was not entirely unpleasant, the particular exhaustion of emotion released, and then he felt that he had been away long enough, that the family would be beginning to notice his absence, and he rose from the bench to begin the walk back toward the house. What happened next was something he tried many times, in the months that followed, to describe with precision, and each time the words came out slightly wrong, as if the experience itself did not quite fit inside any available language. As he stood, something moved through his head, a sensation that resembled standing too quickly after sitting for a long time, but far more complete than that, a tilting and rotation of the visual field that turned the trees and the table and the green afternoon light into something shifting and uncertain, something that could not quite be looked at directly. He sat back down immediately, his hands finding the edge of the bench by instinct, and waited for the sensation to pass, and after what felt like a minute the clearing settled back into its ordinary stillness, and he told himself it was the heat, the emotion, a moment of low blood pressure. There was a reasonable explanation, there was always a reasonable explanation. He tried to stand again, more carefully this time, and the sensation returned, heavier now, more insistent, the clearing seeming to rotate around him in a way that had nothing to do with simple dizziness, the edges of things going soft and strange in the way of images seen through moving water. There was a high, clean tone in his ears that had not been there before, very steady and very clear, and he noticed that the cicadas had stopped, not gradually, as they sometimes do when evening temperature falls, but all at once, between one breath and the next, as if a switch had been opened somewhere in the hillside. The wind had gone too, and the clearing was absolutely quiet in the way that places become quiet when sound has been removed rather than simply ended, a silence with a weight and a texture to it, and he found himself thinking with a distant, almost academic calm that whatever was happening, he should try not to fall. He did not remember falling, but he remembered that the light changed, and that the change was very sudden, and then there was a period with no texture at all, no sense of time, no sensation, no thread of consciousness he could later follow back to any particular moment. When awareness returned, the first thing he registered was darkness, a full and complete darkness, and he was still on the bench, and his body was stiff in the way bodies become after several hours held in the same position, and the air around him was the warm, damp air of a summer night that has not yet cooled. He stood, this time without any dizziness, and looked around the clearing, and the darkness was strange, not quite the ordinary dark of a rural night in the mountains, where one would expect the pale scatter of stars above and the shapes of trees against a sky that is always slightly lighter than the land below it, but something more complete, more enclosed, and harder to read. He could see the ground beneath his feet with a clarity that did not seem to belong to that degree of darkness, as though a different quality of light were operating, and this observation sat uneasily in the back of his mind as he began to walk. He knew the road back to his grandfather's house well enough to walk it without a torch, or he believed he did, and for the first several minutes the path was familiar under his feet, the same lifted roots, the same gentle curve past the old stone wall, the same smell of mountain earth and summer growth that had always characterized that road. But somewhere along the way, he could not name the exact moment, because it happened gradually, the way small errors accumulate into something impossible, the road began to show him things that did not match the road he remembered. A house stood where he was certain there had been a field, its walls of dark timber and unfamiliar proportions, and a stretch of fencing that should have followed the line of a low stone barrier was simply absent, replaced by open ground that showed no evidence of anything having stood there, not even in the compressed grass. He stopped and stood at one point in the middle of the road, trying to locate himself in the landscape, naming things he recognized as anchors and finding that the anchors held but the things between them had shifted, as though someone had disassembled the countryside in the dark and put most of it back in the right places. He continued walking, with the focused and slightly desperate calm of someone who very much needs a reasonable explanation to present itself, and then he recognized the curve in the road just before his grandfather's gate, that particular turn, that exact angle, and the recognition was so complete and so reliable that his chest loosened with it. The house was there, the old house with its dark curved roof tiles and the persimmon tree his grandfather had planted in the garden 30 years before, and the low stone wall along the front, and the wooden gate with its latch that always stuck a little in humid weather, all of it there, all of it apparently correct. The windows were dark, which surprised him, because he had expected at least some of the family to still be inside, but he told himself that the hour must be later than he understood, that everyone had retired or moved to one of the nearby guest houses, and that his absence would be the first thing anyone mentioned to him in the morning. He tried the gate, and it opened, and he walked the path to the front door and tried the handle, and found it locked, and knocked quietly at first, and then a little more firmly, and then waited. After a moment he could see through the frosted glass beside the door the movement of a warm light inside the house, a lamp being carried through a dark room, unhurried and steady, and the sight of it reassured him, because whoever was coming without alarm. The door opened, and the light spilled into the night, and the young man stood in that rectangle of warmth and found himself unable to speak, unable to move, unable to organize what he was seeing into any thought that would hold together, because the person standing in the doorway was his grandfather. He stood there in a cotton yukata, slightly rumpled in the manner of someone who had been resting when they heard the knock, his white hair the same as it had always been, his face exactly the face the young man had known his entire life, including the small scar above his left eyebrow from an accident that had happened long before the young man was born. His grandfather looked at him with an expression of mild, alert concern, the same expression the old man had always worn when something seemed not quite right, familiar down to the slight forward tilt of his head, and then he spoke. The voice was correct, the low, unhurried voice the young man had known all his life, the slight roughness in it that had always been there, the rhythm of speech that seemed to belong specifically to that house and those mountain roads, but the words were not words, or rather they occupied the space where words should have been without delivering meaning. The young man stood and listened, and his grandfather said more things in the same quiet, incomprehensible murmur, and reached forward and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, and the hand was warm and solid and entirely real, and this may have been what finally broke the thin composure that had been keeping him upright. He stepped back, and then he was running, without deciding to run, without any clear destination, only moving away from the light and the figure that could not exist and yet did, down the path and through the gate and along the dark road with its familiar curves and unfamiliar silences. He ran until his lungs simply would not continue, and then he stopped in the middle of the road with his hands on his knees, breathing in the warm night air, in a countryside that was almost entirely the one he had walked every summer of his life and he was beginning to understand, not quite that place at all. He thought of his phone, and the thought arrived with a small rush of relief, because he had forgotten he was carrying it, the ordinary, reliable object in his pocket that connected him to his mother and through her to everything familiar. She answered after a few rings, and her voice was there on the other end, present and real, and he began to speak, and then he stopped speaking, because what was coming back from her was the same as what had come from his grandfather, the shape of speech without its content, a gentle murmur that suggested meaning without offering it, that he listened to with increasing desperation and found no entry point in, not a single syllable. He said a few things more, not knowing whether she could understand him any better than he could understand her, and then the call ended, and she called back, and he looked at the screen for a while before letting the calls go unanswered, because he did not know what he would do if he heard her voice again and still understood nothing. After a time spent standing in the road, doing the slow, difficult work of organizing his thoughts into something functional, he arrived at the conclusion that the most useful thing available to him was the police box, the Koban, which he was fairly certain he remembered from his childhood explorations of the area. He walked toward where he believed it would be, and along the way he noticed the signboards, which were wrong in a precise and unsettling way, not replaced with a foreign alphabet but subtly altered, familiar characters combined with unfamiliar ones, shapes that resembled Japanese writing the way a reflection resembles a face, recognizable in structure but unreadable in detail. The Koban was where he expected it, a small concrete building with its distinctive lamp above the door, and through the window he could see a police officer at a desk in the relaxed posture of someone on a quiet night shift, and this familiar scene, the lamp, the desk, the officer, was enough to make him push the door open. The officer looked up with the mild attention of someone accustomed to the occasional late visitor, and the young man began to say something, the automatic syllable of apology and greeting that opened so many interactions in Japan, and the officer's face shifted into an expression of careful, puzzled attention. What followed was the particular frustration of being in a room with another person who is genuinely trying to help and finding that the space between you is simply impassable, that goodwill on both sides is not enough to cross the distance. He began, at some point, to cry again in the Koban, which surprised him, and the officer moved with the gentle uncertainty of someone who wants to do the right thing and is not sure what that is, and eventually produced a pen and paper and pushed them across the desk. The young man wrote his name in the characters he had always used, and pointed to himself, and tried to communicate with his hands and his expression that he was lost and confused and in need of help, and the officer studied what he had written with an expression suggesting it was legible but puzzling, the way a word in a known script can be legible and still say nothing. The officer made phone calls, and the young man sat beside the desk and looked at the walls of the Koban, which were organized in the familiar way but decorated with slightly different notices in their slightly altered script, and he found himself thinking with an odd calm that this was either a specific kind of neurological event or something that did not have a name. After perhaps 2 hours, a man arrived in a dark suit, not unkind in his manner, but efficient and slightly more purposeful than the officer had been, and this man spoke briefly with the officer and then guided the young man, firmly but without roughness, to a car parked outside, a dark, nondescript vehicle of the kind used by people whose work requires discretion. The drive was long, or felt long, because there was nothing outside the window to locate him, and the suited man made several phone calls in the incomprehensible language, and somewhere in the passage of dark countryside the young man fell into an exhausted sleep. He woke to the car having stopped before a low, spread building that gave the impression of a clinic or research facility, clean lines, carefully maintained, set back from a mountain road with a deliberate quality that seemed slightly mismatched with the rural quiet surrounding it, too purposeful for its landscape. Inside, he was taken to a room with 4 beds, spare and clean, where another man was sitting up and watching him with the attentive expression of someone who has been waiting some time for something of interest to occur. The man had a bandage wound around his head and was perhaps 40 years old, broad-shouldered and bearded, and he waited until the staff had gone before he leaned forward slightly and asked, in completely ordinary Japanese, whether the young man understood him. Hearing it, plain, familiar Japanese, the kind one hears in an ordinary conversation, the kind one does not think about because it has always simply been there, produced a relief so immediate and so physical that the young man had to sit down on the nearest bed for a moment before he could answer. The man, who had come from Noro by a route broadly similar to the young man's own, said that he had been in this place for nearly 3 months, and that he had long since stopped expecting to leave, though he did not say this with particular bitterness, only the flat accuracy of someone who has had a great deal of time to arrive at a conclusion. He said that 2 others had come through the room during his time there, each in the same disoriented and frightened state, and that after a few days each of them had been taken somewhere he could not identify, and he had not seen them since and did not know whether this was a hopeful sign or otherwise. He offered the observation, carefully, that the young man's recent arrival might matter, that in what he had seen, those who arrived sooner seemed to have more options available to them, though he was clear that he was working from very limited information and from the even more limited perspective of someone who could communicate with almost no one in that facility. The days that followed were quiet in the particular way of confinement, not peaceful, but contained, the hours marked by meals brought in without explanation, by visits from staff who were courteous but uncommunicative, and by the unexplained daily routine of injections whose purpose no one clarified and whose effects, if there were effects, were too subtle to perceive. The young man sat on his bed and looked at the ceiling and talked with the Noro man when talking seemed possible, and thought about his family, and thought about his grandfather's face in the doorway light, and turned the events of the past days over and over in his mind, looking for something that would resolve them into a shape he could live with. On the 5th night, or what he calculated to be the 5th night, counting from the evening of his arrival, he woke to the sound of the door opening, and in the low light of the room stood an elderly man in a white coat, small and soft-spoken, with the particular unhurried quality of someone for whom unusual things have long since become ordinary. The old man looked at him for a moment with an expression of mild assessment, and then made a small, unhurried gesture that meant, clearly without requiring language, "Come with me." In a room down the corridor, under fluorescent light that hummed very faintly, the old man asked him in careful Japanese where he had come from, not which country, but which prefecture, which town, and the young man told him, and the old man listened and was quiet for a moment, and then said that he believed the young man could be returned. He explained the conditions in the measured way of someone delivering information that must be complete even if it cannot be fully explained, that the young man must carry nothing from this world back with him, must not seek to demonstrate or prove what he had seen to others, and above everything must not return to the clearing, because a second passage would be different from the first in ways that could not be undone. The young man agreed to everything, with the straightforward and unambiguous sincerity of someone who understands that they have very little to negotiate with and wants only to go home, and the old man nodded and went to make a phone call. A younger man came to collect him, also Japanese, also apparently at ease in that facility, and as they drove away in a black car through the mountain night, this man told him what he knew about the Noro man's situation, which was that he had arrived too late in some sense that the young man could not quite follow, and that the chances of his returning were, in this man's understanding, very small. He felt the weight of this information settle somewhere behind his sternum, the thought of the broad-shouldered man with the bandaged head who had been sitting in that room for 3 months and would likely continue there, to whom he had not been able to say goodbye because the departure had been arranged while he slept. At some point during the drive, the young man became aware of a tiredness unlike the tiredness of a long and frightening week, something deeper and more final, the tiredness of a thing that is almost over, the body beginning to put down what it has been carrying. He was asleep before he could pay attention to falling asleep, and then there was a period with no edges, and then he was lying on his back in the garden of his grandfather's house, looking up at a sky in which the darkness was just beginning, at its lowest eastern edge, to soften into the earliest suggestion of morning. He lay in the grass for a moment, feeling the ground beneath him, smelling the particular smell of that garden, the vegetable plot nearby, the damp warmth of summer earth, the faint sweetness of the persimmon tree overhead, and then he stood and went to the door. The door was unlocked, and he went inside and moved quietly through the familiar rooms, past the altar where the incense had burned down to nothing many hours before, past the low table where his relatives had sat the afternoon of the ceremony, into the kitchen where the first pale light was beginning to arrive at the window. He stood in the kitchen and listened to the house around him, and from deeper inside, from the direction of his grandfather's room, he heard the sound of someone sleeping, the soft and slightly irregular breath of an old man, very quiet in the morning stillness and entirely real. He understood then, or began to, in the slow, iterative way that understanding comes when what must be understood is too large to arrive all at once, that the world to which he had returned was not quite the world he had left on the afternoon of the ceremony. Not the world where his grandfather had died and the family had gathered for the 49th day, not that world, but a world that had branched from his own at some earlier point along a different path, a world where the accident had been avoided or had happened differently or had simply not arrived at the same conclusion. He stood in the kitchen for a long time, listening to the old man's breathing in the next room, holding in his chest simultaneously two things that could not be made to resolve into one another, the knowledge that his grief had been real, that the bones he had held were real, that the funeral had happened, that all of it was true, and the knowledge that the man breathing in the next room was alive, and would be alive in the morning, and did not know that anything had been lost. In the weeks and months that followed, he noticed the small differences carefully and without drawing attention to them, nothing dramatic, nothing anyone else would have flagged, just the particular texture of a life arranged along a slightly different sequence of decisions, and he kept these observations to himself, not as proof of anything, but as a kind of quiet accounting. He did not return to the clearing, and found that he had no need to make an effort to avoid it, because the thought of that particular hollow between the trees carried a weight that made avoidance the most natural thing in the world, in the way one naturally steps around a place where a fall once happened. What he felt about all of it was not simple, and he made no effort to simplify it. There was relief so deep it sometimes felt like a second grief of its own, to have his grandfather alive and approaching his 78th year, still living in the old house, still tending the persimmon tree, and there was also a loss that had no address, a grief that could not be shared because no one in this world had experienced the same departure. He said, near the end of his account, that he was not asking to be believed, that he understood how the story presented itself to someone encountering it for the first time, and that he recognized the shape of it from the kinds of stories that are usually dismissed without much consideration. He said that it had happened regardless, and that it was still happening, in a quiet way, every time he sat across the dinner table from his grandfather and remembered what it had felt like to grieve him, and every time the old man said something ordinary and the young man heard it as two things at once, a voice that should not be there, and a voice he was deeply glad to hear. And that, perhaps, is where the story rests for tonight, in the space between two versions of a world, in the quiet of a garden at early morning, in the sound of an old man breathing in the next room, in the gentle and impossible gift of a grief that found somewhere, through means that cannot be explained, a second chance to become something else. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it fade the way all memories eventually do, softly, without insisting on itself. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one. Let your breath slow, let your shoulders settle a little deeper into wherever you are resting. The night is long, and unhurried, and entirely yours. When you are ready, and there is no rush, truly, our next story takes us to a memory of someone once loved, to the quiet ache that lingers long after a person has gone, and to the strange comfort that sometimes finds us in the most ordinary of places. The apartment they shared was on the third floor of a building that had been put up sometime in the 1970s, its exterior the particular off-white of concrete that has absorbed 20 years of rain and city dust, and inside it held the compressed warmth of a small space that two people had furnished slowly and carefully over time, with attention paid to the few square meters available to them. Icky, who was 28 years old in the autumn this story begins to take its real shape, had lived in this apartment with his wife for 3 years, though he had known her for much longer than that, long enough that the apartment sometimes felt less like a place they had moved into together and more like a natural extension of a shared life that had been accumulating for as long as he could clearly remember. They had first met in elementary school, in one of those ordinary and consequential ways that children meet, sitting near each other in the same classroom in the same row of wooden desks, and something about her had registered with him even then as particular and worth paying attention to, though at 8 or 9 years old he could not have articulated precisely what it was. Through junior high school he had watched her from a comfortable distance, the way a person observes something they admire without quite believing it is available to them, carrying the quiet awareness of her as a kind of background warmth that asked nothing of him and required no immediate action on his part. It was in high school, in the autumn of their first year together in that institution, with the school festival approaching and the leaves in the courtyard beginning to turn, the ginkgo trees going yellow at their tips, the maples holding their red like a secret not quite ready to be told, that he had gathered himself and spoken. He had told her something honest and not particularly eloquent, the way such things are often told at 16, and she had looked at him with an expression he would remember with precision for the next 12 years, and then she had smiled, and then she had said yes, and the world had reorganized itself, quietly and completely, around that single syllable. They had been together through the rest of high school and through their separate university years, navigating with reasonable patience the mild difficulty of a relationship conducted partly across distance, and through all of this the thing between them had held with the particular durability of something that was, at its core, very simple and very honest. When they graduated and began their working lives, the question of marriage arrived not so much as a question but as a natural conclusion, the way a long sentence eventually arrives at its final word, and they married in the spring of the year they both turned 25, in a ceremony small enough that every person present had known them both for years. His wife had been working at a small design firm before the marriage, a position she held competently and without particular complaint, but she had always been drawn toward the idea of homemaking, of managing the household with the same careful attention she brought to everything else she did, and when they married she left her job and took on that life with what seemed to him like genuine and unforced satisfaction. The first 2 years were good, which is perhaps too simple a word for something that was less dramatic than that word implies and more sustaining. They were ordinary in the way that a well-made meal is ordinary, nourishing and consistent, the kind of life that does not produce dramatic stories but that allows two people to grow in the slow, unhurried way that comes from feeling genuinely safe with another person. He came home from work in the evenings, catching the last train before the worst of the rush, and she would have prepared something. Often the smell of dashi reached him before he had finished removing his shoes in the small genkan, that particular and comforting smell of good Japanese stock that means warmth and care and someone who has been thinking about your evening from some hours prior. They would eat together at the low table in the living area, with the television sometimes on at low volume, and they would talk about the day in the easy manner of people who have been talking to each other for years, nothing important, the accumulation of small observations that two people exchange when they are comfortable enough not to perform for each other, and afterward she would clear the dishes and he would make tea, and the evening would unspool at its own unhurried pace until they were ready to sleep. The autumn of their third year arrived with the particular quality that Tokyo autumns have, a sharpness in the morning air that comes almost overnight, the city seeming to exhale the heavy warmth of summer with something like relief, and the light changing from the flat brightness of August to a more slanted and golden thing that gave every surface an additional texture, an additional shadow, as though the world had been rendered in slightly finer detail. He noticed, in the first weeks of that autumn, that something had shifted in the apartment, a change that was not the weather, a new quality to her silences that was different from the ordinary silences they had always shared, which had been easy and undemanding, the natural silences of people who do not need to fill every moment with speech to feel connected to each other. These new silences had a different character, they were not empty but occupied, filled with something she was withholding, and he felt this the way one feels a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm, an ambient awareness that something in the surrounding air has altered without being able to point to the specific moment when it happened, or what had caused it. The meals diminished first, not all at once, but gradually, beginning with the occasional evening when she said she was tired and there was only rice and pickles and a piece of tofu from the refrigerator, and then the occasions when there was a proper meal began to be outnumbered by the occasions when there was nothing at all when he arrived, the kitchen dark and the table bare. He took this without complaint in those early weeks, stopping at the convenience store near his station and bringing home whatever seemed adequate, eating at the kitchen counter or at the low table alone while she sat in the living room with her phone, and telling himself that everyone has difficult periods, that marriages move through seasons the way everything else does, and that patience was the appropriate response. When he tried to speak with her in the evenings, to begin the ordinary conversations that had once been the reliable texture of their shared nights, she would respond with a kind of minimum engagement, a word or two, a brief surface acknowledgement, and then her attention would return to whatever was on her phone screen, and he would find himself holding the rest of what he had intended to say with nowhere to put it. He tried to remember if he had done something to offend her, playing back the recent weeks with the careful attention of someone reviewing a document for errors, looking for the moment when he had misspoken or forgotten something important or failed her in some way he had not noticed at the time, and he could not find it, which left him with the particular helplessness of someone who wants to apologize but cannot identify what they are apologizing for. The physical distance between them, the small ordinary proximities of a shared life that had always closed naturally in the evenings, also widened during those months, quietly and without discussion, until he was lying on his side of the futon in the darkness with the space between them feeling, in the way that small Japanese bedrooms can amplify such things, very significant indeed. He lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling, which was the pale beige of a room that had been repainted more than once, and he listened to the city at night, the occasional taxi, the distant rumble of a train on the elevated line 3 blocks away, the irregular sound of the building settling into the particular stillness of deep winter's approach, and he turned the problem over in his mind. The conclusion he kept arriving at, examining the situation from several directions without being able to find a more satisfying one, was that she had perhaps entered the doldrums that sometimes come to marriages after a few years, the period that some people call the second adjustment, when the warmth of beginning has settled into something more habitual, and the longer project of continuing together must be faced on its own terms rather than on the momentum of novelty. He had heard people speak of this, a colleague at work whose marriage had gone through something similar, an older cousin who had navigated a comparable stretch some years earlier, and they had described it as something a person could move through with patience and intention, that the way forward was not to withdraw but to keep offering, to maintain warmth even when it was not immediately returned, trusting that eventually the warmth would find its way back. And so he kept offering, in the small ways that were available to him, leaving tea on the table beside her without comment, keeping the apartment as orderly as he could manage, stopping at the combini near his office to bring home the things she preferred, a yogurt she had mentioned, the particular biscuit she had liked since university, small things that did not ask to be noticed but that said, quietly, that he was paying attention. She accepted these gestures without particular acknowledgement, and he told himself that this was fine, that care did not require celebration to be valid, that the important thing was to continue and not to require gratitude in return, and for several weeks this quiet effort was enough to sustain him through the evenings that had become so much longer than they used to be. Their wedding anniversary came in September, on a day with clear skies and a breeze that carried the first real suggestion of the coming seasonal change, that particular quality of early autumn air that is warm on the surface but cool beneath, like water that has been resting in sunlight but draws from deeper and colder sources. He had decided, quietly and without telling anyone, that he would mark the occasion with something she would genuinely appreciate, not a grand event, which he sensed would feel too effortful and too deliberate given the current atmosphere between them, but something specific and personal, the kind of gesture that communicates, "I was listening, I know what you love, I have been carrying your preferences with me." He left his office at the usual hour and walked past his usual station exit to the one that faced the small patisserie she had mentioned more than once over the years, the shop with the cream millefeuille that she had described, on a rainy afternoon some time ago, as the best thing of its kind she had ever tasted, a claim he had filed away as useful without knowing precisely when he would need it. The shop was warm and small and smelled of good butter and vanilla and the particular sweetness of pastry cream, and the woman behind the counter wrapped what he chose with the practiced hands of someone who understands that presentation is part of the gift, that the box and its careful tying are part of what is being offered, not merely the container of it. He carried the box home on the train, holding it level with both hands as one is supposed to do, and he felt something that he recognized even as he felt it as fragile, a careful, domestic hope, the kind that does not ask for very much, only for the possibility that a small kind thing might be received in the spirit in which it was intended. She was in the living room when he arrived, seated as she so often was these days with her phone held in both hands and her attention fixed on its screen, and he set the cake box on the low table between them and said something about the occasion, about the anniversary, about the shop she had always said she loved. She looked at the box for a moment, and then she said something that he would replay many times in the weeks that followed, something that carried in it a contempt he had not known she was directing at him. She said that it was a sarcastic gesture, that he was being condescending, that there was something unpleasant and calculated about bringing a cake from her favorite shop, as though that alone could stand in for whatever she felt was missing. He stood in the space between the Genkan and the living area and said nothing for a moment, because the available responses seemed to him either inadequate or worse than silence, and he watched her take up her phone again and resume whatever she had been reading, turning her face back to that small rectangle of light with the completeness of someone returning to something considerably more important. He opened the cake box himself, eventually, and cut a portion, and stood at the kitchen counter to eat it there, because to sit at the low table with the box between them would have required a kind of performance he did not have the energy for, and the cake was very good, the cream precisely sweet, the pastry in its perfect layers, the honey she had mentioned giving the whole thing a late-season warmth. There was something about eating that cake alone in the kitchen, with the apartment quiet around him and his wife on the other side of the thin wall doing something entirely other, that reached him in a way the months of cold silences had not quite managed to, something about the combination of the good taste and the bad circumstance that produced an ache without a clear location in his body. The remaining cake sat in the refrigerator in its box for several days, and he did not offer it again and she did not ask for it, and at some point, without ceremony or comment, he removed what remained and placed it in the bin, and the anniversary passed as the weeks around it had passed, without resolution, without explanation, without any visible movement toward the thing that had gone wrong. But the anniversary evening had planted something in him, a question he had been carefully avoiding, a possibility he had been working very hard not to look at directly, and it grew in the days that followed with the particular persistence of a thought that will not be reasoned away no matter how much effort a person applies to reasoning it. He told himself, repeatedly and with some conviction, that he would not look at her phone, that this was a line he did not want to cross, that trust, even in its current uncertain and diminished form, was something worth protecting, that to surveil a person who had not been definitively proven to have done anything was to commit a harm of its own. He held to this position for most of a week, and then one Thursday evening she fell asleep on the sofa earlier than usual, sometime around 9 o'clock, with her phone resting on the cushion beside her, its screen dim but not quite dark, casting a faint and even rectangle of light on the woven fabric of the armrest. The apartment was very quiet at that hour, the refrigerator making its small, measured contributions to the silence, the building absorbing the compression of a late autumn night, the sound of the street below entirely absent, and he sat in the chair across the room and looked at the dimmed phone screen and thought, carefully and for a long time, about what he was going to do. He thought about it for what must have been considerable time, because when he finally stood and crossed the room his legs had stiffened the way they do when a person has been very still for an extended period, and he picked up her phone carefully, with the deliberate gentleness of someone handling something that might break or might not, and he looked at what was there. What arrived in him in the first few minutes of reading was a kind of stillness, a suspension of the ordinary processing of experience, as though his body had understood the significance of what his eyes were finding before his mind had fully caught up to it, and he stood in the dim living room with his wife sleeping 3 meters away and read with the careful attention he brought to difficult things at work. There was a man in her message history, someone she had been introduced to through a mutual friend, and the thread of their conversations went back further than he had prepared himself for, several months, well into spring, past the point when she had first begun to be cold toward him, the timeline of the two things overlapping in a way that explained rather a great deal. He read slowly, following the shape of the thing, the way the early messages had progressed from the tentative formality of new acquaintance into something much more familiar and much more private, and in the record of these exchanges he found the answers to many things that had puzzled him over the preceding months, including the empty table and the turned back and the evenings given entirely over to the glow of a phone screen. But it was not the fact of the infidelity itself, terrible and clarifying as that was, that moved him most deeply. It was what he found some distance further into the history, the thread in which she had written about him, about her husband, in the manner one writes about someone who is entirely harmless and somewhere very far away. She had described his attempts at reconnection to this man with a lightness that suggested she found them genuinely amusing, the tea he had left on the table, the small things he had brought from the combini, the evenings he had stayed nearby making quiet conversation with someone who was not really listening, and the man had responded in kind, and together they had made of his ordinary marital grief a kind of shared entertainment. There was a message about the anniversary evening, about the cake, about the way he had carried it home and eaten it alone at the kitchen counter with what she described, with a certain amused fondness for the scene, as an expression of resigned hopefulness, and the man had written something that was closer to mockery than to sympathy, and she had replied that she almost felt sorry for him, almost. He read the word almost and stood with it for a moment in the darkened room, his wife's breathing slow and even behind him, and he felt what he would later think of, in the private language of retrospect, as the blood withdrawing from his face, a cold and complete retreat that left him very still, looking at a small screen that had just reorganized everything. He replaced her phone on the cushion beside her with care, in exactly the position it had been, and then he returned to his chair on the other side of the room and sat down in it, and the apartment settled around him in its nighttime quiet, and he looked at his wife's sleeping face for the first time without the unconscious assumption of goodwill that he had always brought to the act of looking at her. She was sleeping very peacefully, which he understood was not itself a statement about her character but which he noticed nonetheless, her chest rising and falling in the unhurried rhythm of someone who is not carrying anything particularly troubling, her expression relaxed and unremarkable, her hands resting loosely near her face the way a child sleeps, and he sat and looked and thought, in the particular quiet of a Japanese apartment at midnight. He thought about the elementary school classroom with its smell of chalk and polished wood, about the careful years of watching her from a comfortable distance, about the autumn afternoon when he was 16 and the leaves in the courtyard were turning and he finally said the thing he had been holding for so long, and about the expression on her face when she answered, the expression he had kept with him like a letter from another place. He thought about all of it with a clarity that surprised him, the memories very precise and fully available, the way memories sometimes become when something fundamental has changed and the mind understands that it is making a record, and arranges the material accordingly, and he sat with the full weight of it in the chair across the dark room from the woman who had said yes on an autumn afternoon 12 years ago. It was not a dramatic unraveling, the way such things are sometimes described in the late-night television dramas that play on the channels she used to watch before she stopped watching things with him. It was quieter than that, more like the moment when a light that has been slowly dimming for some time finally gives out, and you understand that the room is dark now, and you are in it, and this is what the room looks like. He sat until the apartment building had settled completely into the deepest hours of the night, until the refrigerator had completed several of its small and reliable cycles, until the rectangle of sky visible through the gap in the curtains had shifted from the dark blue of late midnight toward the paler and more neutral gray blue of the hours before dawn, when the city is at its most still. Then he went to bed quietly, removing his clothes in the small dressing area with the deliberate care of someone trying not to disturb another person's sleep, and he lay down on his side of the futon and looked at the ceiling in the familiar darkness, and his thoughts slowed in the way thoughts slow when a person has arrived somewhere and no longer needs to be looking for it, and eventually he slept. By morning, something in him had reorganized itself, not resolved, not arrived at peace exactly, but settled into a new configuration, the way the furniture of a room looks after an earthquake has moved it, the same objects standing in different positions, casting different shadows, the room recognizably the same room but no longer the room it had been. He made coffee with the small electric kettle that had been one of the first things they bought together for the apartment, and he stood at the kitchen counter in the morning light coming through the south-facing window with its clear autumn quality, and he felt the particular and unusual stillness that sometimes follows a difficult night, when a person has thought something through to its conclusion and arrived. He had expected to feel devastated, or perhaps furious. These seemed like the appropriate responses, the ones the situation appeared to call for, but what he actually felt was something quieter and more disorienting than either of those things, something closer to the clarity that follows a fever breaking, a sudden very precise view of the landscape that had always been there but was previously somewhat obscured. He could see, in that clear morning light, that the version of himself who had been carrying cakes home from the patisserie and leaving tea on the table and absorbing silences without complaint had been operating on a set of assumptions that were no longer in contact with the actual situation, assumptions about shared good faith and mutual intention that had evidently ceased to apply some considerable time ago. He understood, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee warming his hands and the morning outside going about its ordinary business, that he could not continue to perform warmth and care and ordinary marital affection in the direction of someone who was, in those same moments, treating that warmth and care as material for another kind of entertainment entirely, and that to continue doing so would be a kind of self-erasure he was not prepared to sustain. He went to work on the usual train, in the usual morning crush, and the city moved past the windows with its ordinary business, the tidy geometry of the elevated tracks, the white delivery trucks in the streets below, the school children crossing intersections in their careful lines with their small yellow hats, and he breathed, and thought, and arrived, as he always did, at the station nearest his office. His colleagues noticed nothing different about him, which was as he intended, and the workday passed in its ordinary way, the morning briefing, the emails, the meeting that ran slightly past schedule, the quiet satisfactions of competent work done with attention, and at his desk at lunchtime he ate his convenient store lunch and drank his green tea and thought, at intervals, about what he had decided. He had not quite put it into words yet, the decision, because it was less a decision than a recognition, a clear understanding of what had been true for some time and what was now additionally true, and what he could no longer pretend was otherwise, and the shape of how he would proceed was emerging from that recognition naturally, without requiring him to manufacture intention from nothing. On the evening train home, standing in the packed carriage with one hand on the overhead bar and the city sliding past the windows in the particular golden amber light of a late autumn afternoon, he thought about how he would go forward, and the thought was accompanied not by anger or grief exactly but by a kind of calm and complete attention, the attention of someone who has finished deliberating and is now simply deciding. He would stop pretending, he thought, stop performing the ordinary gestures of a marriage that was, on one side at least, no longer being maintained as a marriage, stop directing warmth and consideration in the direction of someone who had long since stopped directing those things back, and allow the reality of their situation to be visible, accurately reflected, rather than concealed by his continued performance of normalcy. This was not, he told himself on that evening train with the city going amber and grey in the windows, a strategy designed to provoke or to punish. It was a simpler thing than that, a matter of basic honesty about the actual shape of the arrangement he was in, a decision to stop navigating a room as though it were a different room than the one he was actually standing in. The train arrived at his station in the gathering dusk, and he stepped onto the platform and walked the familiar route home through streets he had walked a great many times, past the small shrine on the corner where someone had left the day's offering of rice and salt in their ceramic dish, past the bicycle park, past the convenience store with its reliable brightness, past the building's mailboxes in the lobby. He climbed the stairs to the third floor, removed his shoes in the genkan with the ordinary care he always brought to this task, hung his jacket on its hook, and stepped into the apartment, which was warm and quiet and entirely ordinary in every visible way, and entirely changed in the way that mattered, and he stood for a moment in the threshold understanding both of these things simultaneously. His wife was in the living room, seated as she so often was in the evenings with her phone held in both hands, the television playing softly in the corner at a volume no one was really listening to, the room lit with the particular yellowish warmth of interior lights against the darkening window, and he went to the kitchen without speaking and found what was in the refrigerator and made himself something simple for dinner. They moved through that evening in their two separate silences, which was not so different on the surface from many of the evenings that had preceded it, but which was different underneath, in the quality of his silence, which was no longer the silence of someone waiting for something to change but the silence of someone who has understood something and is sitting quietly with what he now knows. The apartment held them both in its small rooms as it always had, the city maintaining its usual murmur at the distance it always maintained, the autumn darkness arriving at its reliable hour, the refrigerator cycling, the building settling, the minute sounds of a domestic evening at rest, and the chapter rests here, in this ordinary room, in the long moment between one understanding of a life and the next one, where a man sits quietly with a knowledge he has just received, holding it with the careful steadiness of someone who is not yet ready to move but who is, at last, done pretending that everything is fine. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it dissolve the way a dream does when morning light begins to reach the edges of a room, slowly, softly, until it is simply gone. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take it. Let your breath come long and easy, in through the nose, out through the mouth, your body settling a little deeper into the warmth around you. Our next story takes us to a memory of someone once loved, a quiet recollection, gentle as old photographs kept in a drawer, unhurried, held with care. But there is no rush to arrive there. Rest a breath or two more. We are in no hurry at all. By the time the third autumn he had known her had arrived, the young man who told this story had learned to measure the season not by the turning of the ginkgo leaves or the first bite of cold in the morning air, but by the particular sound her voice made when she called him from the train platform, slightly out of breath, slightly confused about which exit she was supposed to take. He worked in a small office building in a part of the city where the streets ran at odd angles to each other, and she had visited him there perhaps a dozen times over the course of their relationship, and still, without exception, she emerged from the wrong exit of the station and had to call him to describe what she was seeing so that he could guide her in the correct direction. He had, at first, tried to explain the layout of the station to her in precise terms, drawing small diagrams on the backs of restaurant receipts and holding the paper in both hands so she could study it carefully, but the diagram seemed only to deepen the confusion rather than resolve it, and she would look at the paper with a kind of earnest concentration that made his chest feel full in a way he could not quite name. The vintage room he called home during those years was a one-room apartment on the second floor of a building that had been old even when his landlady was young, with windows that looked out over a narrow lane where a cat sometimes slept on a wooden gate, and where the smell of someone's dinner drifted up each evening just at the hour when the light turned blue and soft. The tatami in his apartment had been replaced once, perhaps 15 years before, and by now it had taken on the color and slight give of something that had absorbed many quiet evenings, many cups of tea left to cool beside the low table, many afternoons of rain against the window that sounded, in that small space, almost like company. It was in that room that he kept, in a small notebook with a dark green cover, a running account of the things she had said and done that had stopped him mid-thought, that had made him look at her with a kind of helpless wonder, that he could not help recording because they seemed too particular, too genuinely hers, to risk forgetting. The notebook had begun as something close to a joke shared only with himself, a catalogue of the small bewilderment she moved through the world with, the words she misread, the conclusions she reached by routes no one else would have thought to take, but as the pages filled, the tone of the entries had shifted without him quite deciding to shift it, becoming less a record of amusement and more a record of affection. He wrote, for instance, of the afternoon she had told him very seriously that she had been reading about the solar system and had become worried about the moon, because she had read somewhere that the moon was moving away from the Earth very slowly, a few centimeters each year, and she had calculated in her head, with characteristic imprecision, that in about 1,000 years the tides would stop working and all the fish would be thoroughly confused. He had pointed out, gently, that 1,000 years was not quite the relevant timescale for this concern, and that the actual figure was something closer to many billions of years, and she had considered this for a long moment with the tip of her finger resting against her chin, and then said that she supposed that was a relief, but that she still felt a little sorry for the moon, going away so slowly that no one even noticed. He had written that in the notebook that same evening, while the kettle was heating on the small stove in the corner, and even as he wrote it he had been aware that what he was recording was not foolishness at all, but a quality of attention, a way of caring about things that most people did not bother to care about, and that there was something in it that he respected very much even as it made him smile. Her name was Hana, which means flower in Japanese, and she had grown up in a smaller city about 2 hours from Tokyo by train, in a household where her father worked at a municipal office and her mother kept a very tidy kitchen, and both of them had been, she said, rather quiet and serious people who had raised her with great care and considerable puzzlement. She told him once, while they were sitting in a small restaurant near the station waiting for their food to arrive, that her mother had taken her to the doctor to ask whether something was the matter with her, not because she was ill, but because she had come home from school one afternoon at age 8 having apparently spent the entire lunch period explaining to a crow on the school roof that it should not be eating other birds' eggs. The doctor had found nothing wrong, she said, and her mother had sighed in the particular way that her mother had, a sigh that was not unkind but that expressed a certain quiet acceptance of a situation beyond any ordinary management, and from that point forward they had simply allowed her to be as she was, which was, by any measure, entirely and irreducibly herself. What he had noticed, in the early months of their relationship, was that people around her almost always went through a specific sequence of reactions, first a mild confusion when she said something that did not quite connect to what had just been said, then a kind of suppressed laughter that was not cruel but was immediate and involuntary, and then, gradually, a shift into something warmer, a sort of protectiveness, a leaning toward her rather than away. His friend Kenji, who was a careful and somewhat reserved man who worked in accounting and rarely said anything that was not precisely considered, had met her for the first time over dinner at a small izakaya near Shinjuku, where the smoke from the grill made the room feel close and warm and the noise of other conversations created a comfortable privacy around their table. Hana had spent most of the dinner asking Kenji questions about his work, questions that began reasonably enough but drifted by gradual and imperceptible degrees into territory that left Kenji looking at her with the expression of a man trying to find his footing on unfamiliar ground, questions about whether numbers ever felt lonely when they were prime, and whether he thought accountants had a responsibility to feel something about the money they were counting or whether it was better not to. Kenji had taken the train home that evening and sent a message at some point after midnight that said only that she was something else entirely, wasn't she, which was as close as Kenji ever came to outright admiration, and which the young man had read sitting on the edge of his bed in the dark of his vintage room, feeling a complicated warmth that he was only beginning to understand. There was an episode that winter which he recorded in the green notebook with particular care, involving a recipe she had decided to follow for the first time, a stew that her grandmother had apparently made when she was small, the kind of dish that exists in memory more as warmth and comfort than as any precise set of instructions. She had written the recipe down from memory, which had already introduced several uncertainties into the process, and then she had gone to the market and, in a moment of what she later described as a reasonable substitution, had replaced one of the root vegetables with something she thought looked similar but was not, and had also, somehow, doubled the amount of ginger because she had been thinking about something else when she measured it and had simply lost count. He arrived at her apartment that evening to find the small kitchen filled with a smell that was, he would later say, entirely unique in his experience, not unpleasant exactly but aggressively present, a smell that seemed to reach out from under the door before he even knocked. And when she opened it, she was wearing an apron printed with small fish, and she looked at him with the expression of someone who had been hoping very much that he would not notice anything unusual. The stew itself, when he tasted it with the care and neutrality he was trying to project, was not bad in the way he had feared it might be bad, but rather strange in a way he could not categorize, bold and slightly startling, the ginger arriving long after you expected it, the mystery vegetable contributing a sweetness that was unexpected but not entirely unwelcome, the whole thing suggesting a dish from a cuisine that did not quite exist. She sat across from him at the low table on the tatami floor, her legs tucked under her in the way she always sat, and she watched him eat with the focused attention of someone waiting for a verdict, and after a few spoonfuls he told her, quite honestly, that it tasted like nothing he had ever had before, which was true in the most literal sense he could offer. She took this as a compliment, which perhaps in the deepest sense it was, and she ate her own bowl with the comfortable satisfaction of someone who had made something and given it to someone she cared about, and the lamp on the low table cast the warm light it always cast in that room, and outside her window the city moved through its evening in all its ordinary complexity, and the two of them sat in the small circle of warmth that their shared meal had made. He wrote later that the stew had been, in some way he found difficult to explain, one of the best things anyone had ever cooked for him, not because it was skilled or precise or reproducible, but because of the attention behind it, the way she had tried, the way she always tried, with a sincerity so complete it had no room in it for calculation or performance. It was this quality that he kept returning to, in the pages of the notebook and in his own thinking, this absence of performance, this way she had of being exactly what she was without any apparent awareness that she could be anything else, and he had come to think that this was rarer than almost anything he could name. He had grown up in a household, and moved through an education, and entered a professional world, in which almost everyone he knew was performing something, not dishonestly, not with any particular intent to deceive, but shaping their words and expressions toward some desired effect, managing the impression they made, adjusting the version of themselves they offered depending on who was in the room. Hannah did none of this, not because she was incapable of social awareness but because it seemed simply not to occur to her that there was a version of herself that needed managing, and she said what she thought when she thought it, asked the questions that occurred to her without first evaluating whether they were the kind of questions one asked, offered her opinions with the open-handedness of someone who had not yet learned that opinions were things one could withhold. There was an afternoon in the spring of the year this story takes place, a Sunday when the cherry trees in the small park near his apartment had bloomed just enough to make the light coming through them pink and diffuse, when she asked him a question that had stayed with him for a long time afterward. They had been sitting on a bench in that park, eating the convenience store onigiri that had become their standard Sunday lunch when neither of them felt like cooking, and she had been watching a small child on a tricycle navigate the path with great concentration, and after a while she said, quite quietly, that she sometimes wondered whether people who were very smart ever felt lonely in a particular way, lonely because they understood too much, and whether that was worse than being confused about things the way she often was. He had looked at her when she said this, and she had been watching the child still, her onigiri half-eaten in her lap, her hair slightly disordered by the spring wind, and he had thought, and then tried not to think, and then thought again, that she was not asking about other people at all, that the question was something she had been carrying for a while, something she had arrived at on her own in the way she sometimes arrived at things, sideways and alone. He told her that he thought confusion had its own kind of company, that being uncertain about things meant you were still open to them, still moving toward them rather than past them, and she had considered this, turning the onigiri wrapper over in her fingers, and then said that she had never thought of it that way but that it made her feel better, which she said in the particular tone she used when something had genuinely landed, different from her polite tone, quieter and more settled. The green notebook from those years, which he mentioned once to the friend who eventually recorded this story, had by that spring become something different from what it had been when he began it, less a catalogue and more a record of his own growing understanding of who she was, and in rereading the earlier entries he could see, written in his own handwriting, the very moment when amusement had begun its quiet turn into something else. The entry from the evening of the strange stew, for instance, ended with a sentence he did not remember writing but recognized as true when he read it back, a sentence in which he observed that he thought she understood something about goodness that he was only just beginning to learn, and that being around her made him want to be less careful and more honest, which was, he wrote, not a small thing at all. As the spring deepened and the evenings grew longer, the two of them had settled into the kind of rhythm that forms between people who have decided, without formal announcement, that they are going to be present in each other's lives, a rhythm of small habits and accumulated shared references. Of knowing how the other person takes their tea and which seat they prefer on the train and what kind of silence is comfortable and what kind means something is being turned over in private. She had a habit, which he had come to look for, of stopping mid-sentence when something distracted her from the outside world, a bird, a particular cloud, the sound of a bicycle bell 3 streets away, and turning toward it with complete attention for a moment before returning to whatever she had been saying, often picking up the sentence in a slightly different place from where she had left it, as if the interruption had shifted the thought into a new arrangement. He had learned not to redirect her when she did this, had learned that the diversion was often where she was actually going, that the bird or the cloud was somehow connected to the thing she had been trying to say, connected in a way that was more honest than a direct line would have been, and that if he waited, patiently, in the comfortable way he had gotten better at over time, the connection would arrive, and it would be worth the wait. There was a rainy evening in late spring when they had been walking back from a small gallery where a friend of his had exhibited photographs of empty rooms in buildings that were being demolished, rooms stripped of furniture and purpose but still holding, somehow, the memory of having been lived in, and she had been quiet on the walk in the way she was quiet when she was thinking rather than the way she was quiet when she was simply at rest. He had walked beside her under the shared umbrella through streets that were wet and orange with reflected light, the rain making the kind of soft continuous noise against the nylon above them that was almost musical, and after a while she said that the photographs had made her feel something she did not have a word for, a feeling about rooms where people used to be, and she had tried to describe it, which was not always an easy thing for her to do with the more complicated feelings. What she seemed to be reaching toward, as best as he could follow the description, was a sense that rooms remembered things even after the things themselves were gone, that the walls had absorbed something, a warmth, a shape of a life, that did not disappear just because the people did, and she said this without any particular expectation that it was remarkable, as if it were simply a fact she had noticed and was passing on to him because he might find it interesting. He had thought, walking through the rain with the umbrella tilted against the wind, that this was not an airheaded observation, not at all, that it was in fact the kind of thing that most people felt but could not say, and that she had said it without any sense of its being worth noting as unusual, the thought simply arriving and moving from her mind to her mouth without the usual filtering that might have made her hold it back. He told her that he thought she was right, and she had nodded in a way that suggested she had thought so too but was glad to have it confirmed, and they had walked the rest of the way in a comfortable quiet, the rain making a sound on the umbrella that was, in that moment, one of the most peaceful sounds he had ever been inside. His mother had met Hannah once, at a small family gathering in early summer, and had afterward called him to discuss the meeting, which he had been anticipating with some caution, because his mother was a pragmatic woman who had raised him on the principle that what mattered most in a person was reliability and good judgment, virtues she had demonstrated throughout his childhood with quiet and consistent grace. His mother said, after a pause that contained some amount of processing, that Hannah was not what she had expected, that she had expected from what he had described someone who was perhaps a little scattered, a little unserious, but that in person she had found something different, something she was struggling to name, and that she thought his descriptions had been accurate but had somehow, in being accurate, missed the point of the person entirely. He had asked what point she meant, and his mother had been quiet for a moment and then said that she thought Hannah was entirely without guile, and that she had not met many people she could honestly say that about, and that it was not the same thing as being naive, because guile and naivety were not the same thing at all, and that she found herself hoping he understood what he had. He said that he thought he did, and his mother had said good, in the efficient way she had of closing a topic she considered settled, and moved on to other matters, but he had held the word she had used for the rest of that evening, turning it over in the way he had come to turn over things that felt important, that felt like they deserved more than a passing consideration. The word felt right. It felt like it named something true, not only about what she lacked but about what that absence created, a kind of open field in the middle of every interaction with her, a space where the usual calculations did not apply and did not feel necessary, and he had found over time that in that space he himself was less guarded, less considered, more willing to say the uncertain thing, to admit not knowing, to be as he actually was rather than as he intended to appear. There is a certain kind of love, the teller of this story seemed to be reaching toward, that works not by completing you and not by filling in what is missing, but by making it easier to be the thing you already are, by creating around you a kind of atmosphere of acceptance so native and so effortless that you only notice it when you try to imagine it gone. By the summer of that year, the green notebook had grown thick with entries, and he had begun to keep it not on the shelf where books lived but on the low table by the window, where the evening light fell across the cover, where it was easy to reach from the tatami when he sat there with tea in the long and unhurried evenings and thought about her. He had not told her about the notebook, not because it was a secret but because he had not yet found words for what it was, which was something between a diary and a letter he was writing without knowing who would eventually read it, something between a catalogue of specific moments and an attempt to understand, in the act of writing, what had been happening to him over the course of 3 autumns. She had seen it on the table once and had picked it up and looked at the cover, dark green and plain, and had asked if it was a diary, and he had said something imprecise and not untrue, that it was a kind of record, and she had set it back down without asking more, which was either respect for privacy or distraction by the cat visible on the gate outside the window, and with her it was genuinely impossible to know which, and the ambiguity itself was something he had written about. What he wrote that summer, in the warmest months when the fan in the corner turned and the city pressed its heat against the windows, was mostly about small things, the particular way she laughed when something caught her by genuine surprise, the way she held her teacup with both hands even in warm weather, the phrases she used that he had never heard anyone else use, the questions she asked that managed, somehow, to be both obvious and profound at the same time. He wrote about the afternoon she had spent 20 careful minutes explaining to him, with great patience and a diagram drawn on a paper towel, why she believed that soup tasted better if you said something kind to it before eating, because she had once read about a study involving water and words, and while she freely admitted she had misunderstood the study, she said the underlying principle seemed like it was probably still sound. He wrote about the evening she had fallen asleep on the train and woken up at a station 3 stops past where she was going, and had called him not in distress but in a tone of mild philosophical acceptance, and she had described the unfamiliar neighborhoods outside the window as she rode back toward him, a gentle and unhurried commentary on the nighttime edges of the city, the laundry lines and the small gardens and the yellow light of windows where people were living their evenings. He wrote about the way she sometimes said exactly the right thing at a moment when he had been hoping for the right thing without quite knowing what it was, and the way she seemed to do this without any awareness that she had done it, the kindness flowing out of her without accounting for itself, without filing itself under any category of virtue, just moving through her and into the space between them like light through a window that had been left open to the evening. The summer nights in his small apartment were warm in the specific way of Tokyo summer, a warmth that pressed in from all sides and smelled faintly of the city, of concrete still releasing the heat it had stored through the day, of the convenience stores that were open at every hour and cast their cool white light into the lane below, of the particular quality of a night that had not quite cooled and was not yet ready to. On those evenings she sometimes sat on the windowsill with her feet dangling outside and looked down at the narrow lane below with the expression of comfortable attention she gave to everything, the cat on the gate a familiar presence in the dark, the sound of a neighbor's television finding its way faintly up through the warm air, the smell of someone's late dinner drifting past, and she would narrate these things to him sometimes, softly, not expecting a response, just saying what she saw, because saying it aloud made it more real to her. He would sit at the low table and watch her without her knowing he was watching, which was one of the small privileges that a long familiarity gives, and he would think about the word his mother had used and think about the notebook filling up on the table beside him and think about the way the summer had changed something, not dramatically, not in the way that stories mark change, but in the way that water changes stone, slowly, without a particular moment you can point to. And on those evenings, with the fan turning and the city making its nighttime sounds below and her sitting on the windowsill comfortable in her own quietness, he found himself thinking that whatever the correct word was for what had been accumulating in him over 3 autumns and 1 warm summer, it was more than he had expected and more than he had known how to want, and that it was, all of it, inseparable from exactly who she was. The part of this story that belongs to that summer ends, as summer nights end in that part of the city, not with a dramatic cooling but with a gradual softening, the heat giving way to something slightly less insistent, the quality of the dark shifting toward something that knows, somewhere ahead of it, that autumn is approaching, the ginkgo trees on the lane below beginning, in their slow and unhurried way, to consider what they are about to become. And the young man, in the small room that had absorbed so many of his quiet evenings, would close the green notebook at last and set his tea aside, and the cat on the gate below would shift in its sleep, and the narrow lane would lie still under the summer stars, and the question of whether any of this had yet been said aloud, whether the things accumulating in the notebook had found their way into the open air between them, was a question the story was not yet ready to answer, but would hold gently, in the way that certain questions deserve to be held, until the time arrived. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it fade the way a candle fades when you cup your hand around the flame, slowly, gently, until only warmth remains. There is no hurry here. If you need to settle deeper into your pillow, to let your shoulders soften against the mattress, please do that now. Take one slow breath in, and let it go without effort, without thinking about it at all. Our next story takes us to a quieter household, a small home at the edge of a neighborhood where the rooms hold the particular stillness of late evening, and where ordinary moments sometimes carry more weight than anyone expects. Rest easy as we drift there together. The night she told them she was going to marry him, she had expected perhaps a moment of hesitation, a pause while they considered the strangeness of it all, a young woman they had taken in like a stray cat from the rain, now becoming something very different from a stray. She had told them over dinner, at the long low table where she had eaten so many quiet evening meals, the overhead light casting its warm amber across the bowls and the chopsticks and the faces she had come to love without quite meaning to. The father had said, without much ceremony, that his son did not deserve her, and he had seemed to mean it in a way that made her want to laugh and cry at the same time, though she managed to do neither, only holding her teacup tightly in both hands and feeling the warmth spread through her palms. The grandmother, the obeisant, as she thought of her, the grandmother who was not her grandmother and yet who had taken on the weight of that word by some patient act of daily kindness, had clicked her tongue once, in the way that Japanese grandmothers do when they are trying not to show that they are pleased, and then had refilled everyone's cups with unhurried deliberateness, as though the kettle and the pouring and the tea were the ceremony of blessing she meant to give. The mother, the woman who would become her mother-in-law, and who already, in many ways that mattered more than title, was something like a mother to her, had looked at her with bright and serious eyes and asked, directly and without cruelty, whether she was quite sure she did not mind that he had been married before. She had answered that she did not mind, and she had meant it simply, without drama or performance, the way one states a fact about the weather or the time of day, and the mother had studied her face for a moment before nodding once, in the way of someone who has asked the only question worth asking and has received an honest answer to it. The wedding itself was a quiet thing, small and attended by people who truly knew them, held in the particular stillness that small ceremonies in Japan sometimes carry, not the elaborate formality of grand reception halls, but something modest and warm, the kind of occasion where the food afterward is slightly too much and everyone lingers longer than they had planned. She had worn her hair pinned back, and she had felt, standing in that small ceremony with the folded paper and the careful ritual of it all around her, an ache that was not quite sadness and not quite joy, but something between the two, the understanding that the people she had lost were not there to see her, and that the people who were there had chosen, without obligation, to fill a space that cannot truly be filled. Afterward, her new husband had told her that she had looked beautiful, and she had found herself thinking that what she felt most of all was not happiness exactly but something quieter and more durable, something like the word settled, the way a house settles into its foundation over many quiet years, finding its final angle against the earth. She noticed, in the days after the wedding, that people addressed her differently, not dramatically, but in small ways, the slight shift in how the mother spoke to her, the way the father now included her naturally in conversations about household plans, the way even the grandmother's silence had changed its texture, becoming warmer, more companionable, like the silence of someone who has decided to stop reserving judgment. They moved into an apartment not far from his family home, a clean and ordinary place with windows that faced a narrow street, and from the kitchen she could hear, on quiet mornings, the sound of a neighborhood settling into its day, a bicycle bell somewhere, the distant rumble of a delivery truck, the polite exchange of morning greetings between neighbors she had not yet met. The apartment was small by certain standards, but it felt right to her. She had grown up in spaces where you learned not to ask for much room, and she had come to find a particular comfort in smallness, in the feeling of walls close enough that a room could hold its warmth overnight without effort. She continued working at the family company, taking the same route she had taken for years now, past the same corner convenience store with its reliable fluorescent cheerfulness, past the same dry cleaner whose window was always slightly fogged in cold weather, and the familiarity of it felt like a gift she had not asked for but was deeply grateful to receive. 2 or 3 evenings a week, they would walk the short distance to his parents' home for dinner, and she would sit again at the low table where she had eaten so many meals before her life had changed its shape, and the grandmother would serve the rice in the particular way she always did, heaped slightly fuller than necessary, as though abundance were a form of affection she had developed the habit of expressing with a rice paddle. His mother would talk about the things that mothers talk about at the dinner table, the neighbor's new garden, a television drama she had been following with great investment, a recipe she had read about and wanted to attempt, and his father would respond in the measured and unhurried way of a man who has learned that most conversations are not emergencies and can be addressed at the comfortable pace of a long meal. She had wondered, sometimes, in the earliest weeks of her marriage, whether she was intruding on something that did not belong to her, whether the warmth she was given was something she was borrowing rather than something she had earned, and on those quiet evenings she would sit a little straighter and offer to help clear the dishes before anyone had to ask. But his mother had a gift for making a person feel that their presence was not merely tolerated but genuinely wanted, in the same way that certain rooms feel welcoming the moment you step inside, not because of anything you can name exactly, but because of something in the air, something in the proportion of light to shadow, something in the way the kettle is always already on. She had begun to let herself believe, by slow and careful degrees, that this was something she was allowed to keep, not as a guest, not as a ward, not as a young woman whom a good family had taken pity upon, but as someone who belonged to this particular corner of the world in the way that one belongs to a place after enough time and enough meals and enough evenings have passed. The months moved through their seasons with the unhurried pace of a life that is not unhappy. There were cherry blossoms she walked under without rushing, because she understood now that rushing past beautiful things is a habit of people who have not yet learned that time is not something you outrun, only something you walk through at the speed it chooses. There were small difficulties in the marriage, as there are in all marriages, moments of tiredness, of crossed intentions, of words said at the wrong hour in the wrong tone, but nothing that the morning could not smooth over, and she found that the small difficulties were easier to carry because she could see, each time she looked up from them, the shape of the life she was slowly building. She had almost stopped noticing the particular ache that comes from being a person with no family to call in an emergency, the ache that is not grief exactly but rather the awareness of a kind of structural solitude, a scaffolding missing from one side of the building of oneself, because the scaffolding had, in its quiet way, been replaced by something she had not known to ask for. She thought, on the kind of still autumn afternoons when such thoughts arrive without invitation, that this was perhaps the most surprising thing life had offered her, not that good things had come, because she had always tried to believe that good things were possible, but that they had come in a form she could not have anticipated, assembled out of ordinary dinners and borrowed grandmothers and a mother-in-law who made her lunch. And then, in the way that changes arrive when a life has grown comfortable enough to feel permanent, the transfer came. Her husband came home one evening with the look of a man who has been rehearsing a conversation all the way home on the commuter train, his face composed into a careful neutral expression that she had learned to recognize as the expression he wore when he was about to say something he was not sure how to begin. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table and told her, without elaboration, that his company had assigned him to a new posting in Sendai, which is a city in the northern part of Japan's main island, where the winters arrive early and stay late, and where the snow is not the decorative snow of picture books but the thick and serious accumulating kind that changes the character of everything it covers. She had nodded, and said that of course she would go with him, and she had meant it without reservation, because she understood that a marriage is not a thing you stay in only when it is convenient, and besides, she had already moved her whole life once before, had already demonstrated to herself that she could make a home from very little if the situation required it. She had not yet understood how different it would be, the way one sometimes does not understand the weight of a thing until one is required to carry it. They broke the news at the family dinner table, on a Wednesday evening when the mother had made a dish she particularly liked, and she sat with the knowledge of the coming departure sitting quietly in her chest while the meal continued around her, the familiar sounds of that familiar kitchen taking on, for the first time, the quality of things she would miss. The mother had said that they would write, and that they would call, and that Sendai was not so far, and had then excused herself to attend to something in the kitchen, and she had sat at the table and looked at the grandmother's hands resting on the table and found herself memorizing the particular brown and warmth of them. The drive north, when they made it in his car with the back seat stacked with boxes and the passenger seat holding a bag of things she had wanted to keep within reach, took them through landscapes she had never seen before, the flat edges of paddy fields already harvested, the dark green of cedar forests pressing close to the road on either side, the mountains in the distance that seemed to lean slightly toward the highway as though curious about the small humans passing below. She watched the scenery change from the passenger window with a feeling she could not quite name, something like curiosity and something like unease sitting together in a single chest, and she found herself thinking that all journeys feel like this at their beginning, as though you are moving towards something that has not yet decided what it will be. Sendai received them with the particular reserve of northern cities in late autumn. The sky was the color of old pewter, the trees had already surrendered their leaves, and the streets, though wide and clean and perfectly organized, had the feeling of a place that is preparing itself for something colder, a place that has learned not to be surprised by difficulty. Their new apartment was on the 4th floor of a building near a wide road, and from the living room window she could see a small park where the last few trees still held some pale brown leaves, rustling in a wind that came from a direction that felt different from the wind she was used to, as though the north had its own particular weather instructions, its own way of telling the air how to behave. She unpacked their boxes with the methodical care of someone trying to impose familiarity on a space that does not yet feel familiar, placing known objects in unknown places, the photograph she had kept, the clock that had sat on the shelf in the last apartment, the ceramic mug she had bought years ago from a small shop near the Osaka family home, as though these objects could anchor a new place to the accumulated weight of a life. Her husband left early each morning and returned late each evening, as men do when they are new to a posting and working hard to establish themselves among people who do not yet know them, and she understood this, and she found things to do with the hours his absence created, learning the new neighborhood street by street, the way she had learned all the neighborhood she had ever lived in. She found a supermarket she preferred, a small bookshop near the train station that had a comfortable quality of light inside it, a park route that was pleasant even in cold weather if you walked it briskly enough to keep warm, and she told herself that this was how a new place became yours, by the slow accumulation of such small and particular knowledge. But the evenings were long in a way she had not been prepared for, long and quiet in the manner of evenings in an apartment where the walls do not yet feel like your own walls and the sounds of the building around you are the sounds of strangers whose habits and schedules you have not yet learned to read. In the apartment they had left, she had known that 2 or 3 times a week, there was a kitchen nearby where the light was always warm and the conversation was easy and someone would refill her cup without being asked and the evening would pass pleasantly, and she had not understood, until the thing was gone, how much of her daily equilibrium had been quietly resting on exactly that. She called his mother on the evenings when the apartment felt particularly still, and they talked about ordinary things in the careful way of a person who does not want to seem like they are struggling, asking about the garden, about the grandmother's health, about small news from the neighborhood she no longer lived near, and his mother always answered warmly and without pressing. The winter in Sendai arrived with a seriousness she had not been fully prepared for, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the patient and accumulating way that northern winters come, each day a degree colder than the one before, each morning a little darker at its edges, the sky lowering itself toward the rooftops with the unhurried confidence of something that has done this before and knows exactly how far it intends to descend. She found the snow beautiful at first, in the way that those who have not grown up with snow often find it beautiful, the way it softened the park below her window, the way the cars wore it like caps, the way the world briefly became quieter beneath its weight, as though the city had agreed to lower its voice for a while. But beauty, she discovered, is not the same as comfort, and by the time the snow had been falling for several weeks it had become simply the backdrop of a mood she did not quite have a name for, not sadness, exactly, not the sharp grief she had known before, but something lower and more ambient, like a sound in the walls of a house that you stop being able to ignore. She ate her dinners alone more often than not, quiet meals at the small kitchen table while her husband was still at the office or at one of the evening gatherings that come with a new posting, the drinks with colleagues that last longer than intended, the obligations of professional sociability that are not optional when you are trying to find your footing in a new environment. She understood this, and she did not resent it, and she made herself proper meals and sat at the table and ate them without rushing, because she had decided that eating properly and sitting at the table rather than standing at the counter were small acts of self-respect she was going to maintain regardless of whether anyone was there to observe them. But she noticed that the food tasted differently when eaten in silence, and she noticed that she was choosing simpler and simpler things to cook, because elaborate cooking for one person in an unfamiliar kitchen felt like more effort than the result could justify. And she found herself one evening making only rice and miso soup and pickles and sitting with this very simple meal and finding that she could not quite finish it. She had known loneliness before, had known it in the months after her grandmother's funeral, in the particular silence of a small apartment when you are 20 years old and the only person in the world who knew you from the very beginning is gone, and she had thought that she had learned something from that loneliness, some knowledge that would make future loneliness easier to carry. But this loneliness was a different shape from the one she had known, because it was not the loneliness of having no one but the loneliness of being far from the people she had, and that distance, which could in theory be collapsed by a phone call or a train ticket, felt in the cold evenings of Sendai like something more absolute than distance ought to be. She began to feel, without making any announcement of it to herself or anyone else, that she was not quite herself, not in any dramatic or sudden way, not in a way that required any particular response, but in the small and quiet ways that a person's well-being recedes when the days are short and dark and cold, and the evenings are long, and the apartment is still, and the sounds of the street below carry up with the impersonal clarity of sounds that have nothing to do with you. She had grown thin without quite noticing it, thin in the way that people do when their appetite for food retreats gently along with their appetite for other things, when the business of eating alone feels like more effort than the nourishment it returns, and a cup of tea feels like enough for an evening, and she told herself that she was simply not as hungry as she used to be, that this was a natural adjustment to a different pace of life. The city of Sendai was not unkind to her, it was simply indifferent, as large cities are indifferent to the individuals who move through them, and indifference is not cruelty, she understood that, but on the evenings when the wind came off the mountains and moved through the street below her window with a particular cold insistence, indifference was not quite what she needed. She would stand at the kitchen window sometimes in the early evening and watch the snow falling in the amber light of the street lamps below, each flake visible individually for a moment before it joined the white accumulation of the ground, and she would find herself thinking, with a vividness that surprised her, about the kitchen in Osaka where the radio was always on at a low murmur and someone was always moving around and the smell of dinner announced itself long before the meal was ready. She did not tell her husband that she was not quite herself, because she could see that he was working hard and was tired in the particular way of a man trying to prove something to people who do not yet know him, and because she believed that her discomfort was temporary and would resolve itself when spring came and the light returned and the city became familiar enough to feel like home. She told herself, on the mornings when she stood in front of the bathroom mirror and noticed that her face looked slightly further away than it should, that she was adjusting, that cities take time, that she had always been a person who managed her difficulties quietly and privately, and that this difficulty was not large enough to require anything more than patience. She read more than she had in years, sitting in the small living room with a book on her lap and a cup of something warm on the table beside her, following sentences that led into other times and other places, and she found that this helped in the way that books have always helped people who are somewhere they do not quite want to be, by offering, for the duration of a chapter, a different somewhere. She went for long walks on the days she did not work, through the streets of a city that was becoming more familiar to her footsteps if not yet to her heart, and she observed the people she passed with the careful attention of someone who has spent much of their life watching others from a slight distance, the elderly man doing his slow circuit of the park, the children in their padded winter coats waiting at a crossing, the young woman ahead of her with a convenient store bag swinging from one wrist. Her husband, on the evenings when he came home at a reasonable hour, was not unkind. He would sit with her at the dinner table and talk about his day with the slightly flattened energy of a man who has been talking to people all day and is now talking to one more person, and she would listen and respond, and the conversation would be pleasant enough, a clean and ordinary thing that fit neatly into the space between dinner and sleep. But the late evenings grew more frequent as the winter deepened and the demands of the new posting accumulated, and she began to hear the sound of his key in the front door as a kind of measure. Early meant one kind of evening, late meant another, and late meant that she had already cleared the dishes and turned off the kitchen light and found her way to the sofa with a book she was no longer quite reading. She would hear him in the entryway, the sounds of a man moving carefully in the dark, trying not to wake her, the soft thud of shoes set down, the rustle of his coat, the particular quality of silence that a person who has been drinking tries to produce, and she would lie still and listen and feel the complex tenderness of someone who loves a person and is also, quietly and without making a fuss about it, quite lonely. She found herself thinking often, during those long Sendai evenings, about her grandmother, about the particular quality of her grandmother's presence in a room, the sound of her footsteps in a small apartment, the way she folded laundry with a certain absorbed precision, the shape of her hands around a teacup, the soft sound of the evening news playing in the room next door, and she understood that what she was feeling was not exactly grief, because grief was something she had already moved through, but something adjacent to it, something like the awareness of absence in a new location. She thought about the family home in Osaka with the warmth one thinks about a place that represents something larger than itself, not just the house but the feeling of being in it, the low table and the amber light and the sound of the kettle and the grandmother's particular companionable silence, all of it assembled into a single feeling that she could not name but could call up clearly when she closed her eyes in a cold apartment in the north. One evening, in the late weeks of winter, around 8 o'clock in the blue-grey quiet of a Sendai night, the phone rang, and it was his mother calling in the way she sometimes did on evenings when perhaps some instinct told her to reach for the telephone, the instinct of someone who has been paying careful attention to another person for a long time and has learned to trust what that attention tells her. She answered and they began to talk in the usual way, about the weather in Osaka, about a small trip the grandmother had been discussing, about a neighborhood matter of no great consequence, and she responded in the bright and composed voice she had been using for months now, the voice of a person who is managing perfectly well and has nothing of particular concern to report. She talked about the snow in Sendai and said it was beautiful, which was true, and she said that she had found a good tofu shop near the station, which was also true, and she said that her husband had been very busy but that things were going well at his new office, and all of this was true, and none of it was the thing she was actually thinking. And then something shifted, in the way that things sometimes shift without warning when a voice you love says your name with a particular gentleness, not Maruko in the formal register, not in the bright social register, but in the quiet register that his mother kept for moments when she was speaking to a person she actually saw, and not just a version of that person assembled for public presentation. She found that she was crying, in the quiet and unstoppable way of someone who has been not crying for a long time and has now used up all the not crying that was available to her, and she said that she was sorry, and she said that she did not mean to, and she said only that her husband was not home yet and that she was, and here she searched for the word that would be true without being too large, and found only the true word, lonely. His mother listened without interrupting, in the particular way of someone who has learned that listening is not a passive act but requires its own kind of stillness and discipline, and when she spoke she did not offer solutions or reassurances or a plan for how things would improve, she said only that she heard her, and she said it in the way that the word for hearing, in Japanese, can carry within it something close to understanding. They talked for a while longer, and by the time she set down the phone the worst of it had passed, the way rain sometimes eases without announcing its intention to ease, not into brightness, not into anything that required a new response, but into something quieter and more bearable, a grey that had been wrung of some of its weight. She made herself a cup of tea and sat down with her book, and the apartment was still around her, the winter pressing gently against the windows, the snow outside continuing its patient accumulation, and she felt, in the way that one sometimes feels after a long-held breath is finally released, something that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it, something like the first sign that a room is beginning, very slowly, to warm. Her husband came home past midnight, in the way he had been coming home, and she heard the careful sounds of his arrival in the entryway, the shoes set down, the coat hung up, the deliberate quietness of a man who knows someone is sleeping and is trying to honor that, and she was already nearly asleep by then, the teacup rinsed and set on the drying rack, the book closed on the table beside the sofa. She did not tell him in the morning about the phone call, because she was not certain how she would have begun the telling, and because the morning was full of its ordinary requirements, breakfast, the route to work, the small negotiations of a shared life, and the phone call felt like something that belonged to the evening that had held it, not something to be moved into the different light of morning. She pulled the covers up in the dark bedroom and listened to the sound of the snow, which makes almost no sound at all as it falls, only the faintest whisper against glass if you are very still and very quiet and paying the right kind of attention, and she found herself thinking that snow has always seemed to her like a form of patience, all that falling, and so little need to be noticed doing it. The city of Sendai lay quiet under its winter, the streets empty in the late hour, the park below dusted white, the particular silence of a northern night in February settled over everything like a second snow, and somewhere in the distance a train passed along its invisible track and was gone before the sound of it fully arrived. She slept, and the apartment held its warmth as best it could, and somewhere between that quiet room and the house in Osaka where the lights would not yet have been turned out for the night, something had passed that could not quite be measured or named, only felt, the way you feel the change of season before you see it, in some quality of the air that knows before the calendar does. And that, for tonight, is where the evening rests. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet footsteps fading now like the last note of a song you can almost remember. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one, let your breath come slowly, let your shoulders settle a little deeper into wherever you are resting. The night holds plenty of time, and the stories will wait for you. Our next story takes us to a quieter household, a place where the rooms are small and the evenings are long, and where one person discovered something unexpected tucked between ordinary days. But first, just breathe. You are safe, you are still, and there is nothing you need to do right now except rest. The envelope arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, tucked between a utility bill and a folded advertisement for a grocery sale he would never bother to visit, and he almost missed it entirely as he sorted through the small pile on his kitchen counter. It was a pale cream envelope, slightly thicker than the standard kind, and his name had been written on the front in a handwriting he recognized at once, even after all those years, even though he had not seen it since the last of the moving boxes had been carried away through the door. He set the other letters down and stood there for a long moment, the overhead kitchen light humming faintly above him, one hand resting on the counter's edge while the kettle he had filled a few minutes earlier began its slow, patient climb toward the boil. The handwriting belonged to Shizuka, his former wife, the woman he had been married to for 7 years and divorced from for nearly 10, and he could not quite name the feeling that moved through him when he saw it, something between recognition and a soft, old ache, like pressing your finger against a bruise you had forgotten. He did not open it right away, because there are moments in a life when a person knows, without being entirely sure how they know, that what they are about to receive will require them to sit down first, and he respected that knowing. He made his tea instead, unhurrying himself, pouring the water with steady hands into the ceramic cup his mother had given him years ago, watching the pale amber color seep slowly outward from the leaves, and then he carried the cup and the envelope together to the low table by the window. Outside, the evening had settled into that particular blue-gray of late autumn, when the light leaves the sky gradually and the city below seems to hold its breath for a moment between the end of the working day and the beginning of the quiet night. He lived on the 4th floor of a modest building in a residential part of the city, and from his window he could see the narrow street below, a single lamppost casting its soft circle of light onto the wet pavement, because it had rained earlier that afternoon and the stones still held their shine. He sat cross-legged on the tatami mat beside the low table, the envelope resting in his lap, and he found himself noticing small things, the sound of a distant train, the faint smell of the cool evening air coming through the window he had left slightly open, the warmth of the cup between both palms. He was 51 years old now, and he had not thought about Shizuka in any sustained way for a long time, not because he had forgotten her, but because the memories had softened into something he did not often take out and examine, the way one feels about a book read long ago whose title you remember clearly but whose pages you can no longer quite bring into focus. He set his tea down on the low table and opened the envelope carefully, sliding out a letter that had been written on 3 pages of the same pale cream paper, folded together in thirds, covered on both sides in her careful, measured hand. She had begun the letter, he would understand later, not with an apology, as he had half expected, but with a quiet statement of intention, that she had been thinking for a long time about whether to write, and that she had finally decided she owed him the truth, not because it would change anything at this distance, but because carrying it alone had grown, over the years, too heavy. He read those opening lines twice, slowly, feeling the words settle into him the way a stone settles through still water, all the way to the bottom, and then he continued reading into the body of the letter. She wrote that she had been unwell in the final year of their marriage, not in the way she had told him at the time, not the vague fatigue and headaches she had attributed to the pressures of work, but something more serious, something she had received a diagnosis for and then, for reasons she went on to explain, kept entirely to herself. The diagnosis had been uncertain at first, the kind that doctors speak about in careful language full of possibilities and statistics and words that carry weight without yet having a definite shape, and she had sat alone in the clinic hallway afterward for nearly half an hour, watching other patients come and go through the glass doors, before she had felt able to stand up and take the train home. She had not told him because she had not yet known how, and because she had needed time to understand the situation herself first, and because, she wrote, she had been afraid in a way that is difficult to describe except to say that she had felt very young and very alone in that hallway, in a way she had not felt since childhood, sitting in a hospital waiting room the day her grandmother had been admitted. He remembered that period now, reading her words, and he found himself seeing it differently, the evenings when she had seemed distant and turned inward, the nights when she had gone to bed early without giving any particular explanation, the times when he had caught her standing in the kitchen doorway looking at nothing specific, her hand still at her sides. He had not pressed her during those months, partly out of the kind of quiet deference he had always shown her interior moods, and partly, he admitted to himself now in the lamplight, because he had been preoccupied with his own work that year, a difficult project with long hours, and he had been guilty of the particular self-absorption that comes from mistaking busyness for presence. She wrote that after the diagnosis had become clearer and the doctors had mapped out a course of treatment, she had made a decision, one she knew he might not understand, a decision she had questioned many times in the years since, but which had felt, at the time, like the only way she could imagine protecting him. She had decided to leave the marriage before the treatment began, so that he would not be bound to her by obligation, so that he would not spend the coming uncertain years as her caretaker, as her companion through hospitals and waiting rooms and all the long, slow hours of whatever the treatment would bring. He put the letter down on the table for a moment and looked out the window, at the lamppost and the wet street and the small orderly darkness of the autumn evening, and he breathed very slowly, in the manner of someone who feels the ground shift slightly beneath them and needs a moment to understand where the new balance is. He had been angry when Shizuka had asked for the divorce, not in the sharp explosive way but in a slow, bewildered way, the particular anger that comes when something you are given makes no sense and the explanation offered is too thin and too carefully arranged to be the whole truth. She had told him only that she needed space, that she had been unhappy for some time, that she was sorry, and she had delivered these words in a voice so measured and so composed that he had not known where to place his own feelings, had found himself with nothing large enough to push against, and so he had said very little and signed what needed to be signed and watched her go. He had spent the first year afterward in a kind of suspension, going to work and coming home and making meals he barely tasted, turning the question of what he had done wrong over and over in the quiet evenings, wondering what quality of himself had made her want to leave so precisely, without giving him enough of a reason to argue against. And here, 10 years later, in a letter written on cream paper in her careful hand, the reason was arriving, sentence by sentence, in the pale lamplight of an autumn Tuesday, and it was not what he had imagined, not what any version of his wondering had produced. She wrote that the treatment had been long and at times frightening, that there had been months when she had felt the outcome was far from certain, and months when she had allowed herself a cautious and fragile hope, and that she had moved through all of it in an apartment on the other side of the city, with the steady, tireless company of her younger sister, who had not left her side throughout. She wrote that she had thought of him often during that time, not with regret exactly, or not with regret alone, but with a kind of slow wondering, the way one thinks of a road not taken, not with bitterness, but with a quiet and recurring curiosity about the shape things might have had if a different choice had been made. She wrote that her sister's presence during those difficult months had taught her something she had not known before, what it felt like to be loved by someone who simply stayed, who did not need you to be well or productive or easy to be around, who showed up in the morning regardless of whether the morning held good news or difficult news. He found himself thinking, as he held the second page, about the nature of that kind of endurance in love, whether it was something a person simply had or something a person built through practice, and he wondered honestly whether he had possessed it, whether he would have been able to stay steady through what she had described without letting the watching change something essential in him. He did not know the answer with any certainty, and Shizuka had not asked him to know it. She had simply written what had happened and what she had believed and what she had decided, and he felt, receiving it, that he owed her the respect of reading without flinching, without rushing to defend himself or her. The second page of the letter described what came after the treatment, the years she called quietly recovery, a period she said had stretched longer than she had expected, not because the illness returned to trouble her, but because the process of becoming well again was its own kind of labor, slower and less legible than the illness itself. She had moved to the city where she had grown up, a smaller city on the coast, where her parents had retired to a modest house near the harbor, and she had spent 2 years living close to the sea, walking in the early mornings along the waterfront, watching the fishing boats move out into the grey water, rebuilding herself slowly in the cool salt air and the uncomplicated rhythm of tides. She had returned, eventually, to the work she had always loved, teaching at a small elementary school, and she wrote that the children had been, without knowing it, a kind of daily medicine, because they required such complete and simple presence, such undivided attention to the small and immediate, that there was very little room left for the larger, heavier thoughts she was learning to set down. She wrote that she had found her way, over time, to a kind of contentment that she had not expected to find, not the dramatic happiness of younger years, but something quieter and more reliable, the contentment of a life arranged slowly and honestly, without too many illusions about what it could hold or what it was required to be. She had married again, she told him, 5 years earlier, a widower with 2 grown daughters who lived nearby, a gentle and unhurried man who taught secondary school history and liked to spend his weekends tending a small garden behind the house, and she wrote that she was, by all the measures she could honestly apply, at peace with where she had arrived. She was not writing to reopen anything between them, she made carefully clear, and she was not asking anything of him, not forgiveness, not understanding, not even a reply, though she wrote that a reply, if he felt moved to send one, would not be unwelcome, would in fact be received with gratitude. She was writing because she had reached a place in her life where the things left unsaid had begun to feel like a small but persistent debt, and she had decided that the honest thing, the kinder thing, was to pay it, even at this distance, even this late. She wanted him to know that the ending of their marriage had not been a consequence of his failures, that he had been, in the way she had most needed, a kind and steady presence throughout the years they had shared, and that the choice she had made to leave had been entirely her own, made in fear and in what she had believed to be love, however imperfect and private that love had been in its expression. He set the second page down carefully on the low table beside his cold tea and sat for a time without reaching for the third page, letting the room be quiet around him, letting the words he had already absorbed continue settling, the way light continues to change in a room after the sun has already moved. The lamp-post outside had not moved, and the street was still wet and still reflecting its one small circle of light, and somewhere in the building above him he could hear the faint and ordinary sound of a neighbor moving through their evening, perhaps washing dishes, the soft familiar percussion of water running through a pipe. He found himself thinking about the year they had met, when he had been 32 and she 30, and they had been introduced through a mutual colleague at a small gathering in someone's apartment in the eastern part of the city, and he had spent most of that evening talking with her about books they had both read and places they had both visited alone and food they had both, independently, decided they loved. He had liked her immediately, not with urgency but with a calm and growing recognition, and he had thought, riding the train home that night through the lit tunnels under the city, that she was someone worth knowing properly, worth the effort of becoming, in turn, worth knowing, and he had carried that thought carefully for several weeks before doing anything about it. Their marriage had been, he believed now, sitting with his cold tea in the autumn quiet, a genuinely good one, not without its share of ordinary difficulty, but sustained by a mutual respect and affection that he had not always named clearly while he was inside it and had only come to understand more fully once it was finished. He had wondered sometimes, in the years since, what he might have done differently, whether there had been moments when he might have asked better questions, stayed more present through her silences, noticed the things she had not said, and the wondering had never been sharp enough to cause real pain, only present enough to hum at the edge of a quiet evening. He picked up the third page now, the final page, and read through the last section of the letter slowly, in the manner of someone who knows that what they are reading is coming to its end and wants to give the ending the attention it deserves. She wrote in the final section about small things, the neighborhood they had lived in together, a ramen restaurant on the corner they had frequented on Friday evenings when they were both too tired to cook, the brief winter when they had taken in a stray cat before the cat had decided, with the serene authority that cats alone possess, that it preferred the retired woman who lived below them. She wrote that she sometimes passed through that neighborhood when she visited the city, and that she looked at the restaurant to see whether it was still there, and that it was the same worn, Noran, hanging in the doorway, the same smell of soy and broth drifting into the street when she passed close enough. She wrote that she hoped he had built a life he was comfortable inside, and that she hoped the years had been, in the ordinary sense of the word, kind to him, and that she thought of him as she imagined he thought of her, occasionally and gently and without pain, the way one remembers a chapter in a story that was well written and whole in itself, even though the narrative moved somewhere else afterward. In the final lines of the third page, she wrote that she was grateful, and that she was sorry for the manner in which she had chosen to leave, for the insufficiency of the explanation she had offered at the time, for the confusion she knew it had left behind her, and that she hoped this letter, arriving 10 years late and imperfect as it was, might be received in the spirit in which it had been sent, which was the spirit of honesty and of care. She signed it with her first name only, Shizuka, in the same careful hand that had written everything that came before, and below her name there was nothing else, only the white space of the page, which felt, in its own way, complete. He sat for a long time with the 3 pages laid out on the low table, arranged in their proper order, the lamp-post outside casting its quiet light onto the wet street, the building above him settled now into silence, whatever neighbor had been moving through their evening finished with their small evening tasks. He was not entirely certain what he felt, and he understood that this was acceptable, that some feelings do not arrive already named but must be given time to settle into something recognizable, the way objects find their places in a room you have recently moved into, the way a new space gradually becomes familiar through the accumulation of ordinary mornings. What he felt was something adjacent to grief, though not the sharp grief of active loss, something softer and more diffuse, the grief of understanding, the particular feeling that arrives when a story you believed you knew turns out to have had a whole other room in it, behind a door you never noticed, a room full of things that arrange the rest of it differently. He also felt something that moved in the direction of relief, though that word was not precisely right either, perhaps more accurately the feeling of a question that had rested quietly at the edge of thought for 10 years finally receiving its answer, not the answer he might have invented for it, but an answer that was complete and honest and arrived, however late, in good faith. He thought about Shizuka walking along a harbor in the early morning, the fishing boats pulling away from the docks, the salt air coming off the water, the slow work of rebuilding a life in a city close to the sea, and he found that the image was not difficult to hold, that he could carry it with something genuinely close to warmth. He thought about the choices people make when they are frightened and trying, at the same time, to be generous, the ways that love can take shapes in a crisis that are very hard to see as love until much later, when time has given you enough distance to read the whole shape of the thing rather than only the part you were standing closest to. He thought about his own years since the divorce, the work he had given himself to, the friendships he had made slowly and maintained carefully, the particular small habits and accumulated routines that had, without his quite noticing, settled into a life that felt genuinely his own, built from his own choices and no one else's. He thought about what it means to be offered the truth of something after a long time, whether the lateness of it changes its value or whether honesty delivered with care is still honesty, still a kind of gift, still worth the receiving regardless of when it arrives. He did not yet know whether he would write back, and he decided, sitting there in the autumn stillness with his long cold tea and her 3 pale pages arranged in front of him, that he did not need to decide tonight, that some things are allowed to rest in the space of not yet knowing for a little while, like seeds in the ground before the season turns. He folded the pages back the way they had been folded inside the envelope, slowly and with care, and he placed them back inside and set the envelope in the corner of the low table where it would be present in the morning, solid and real and requiring nothing of him immediately. He went to the kitchen and rinsed his cup and refilled it with fresh tea, standing quietly at the counter in the small apartment, listening to the faint sounds of the city as it moved deeper into the evening, the occasional distant rumble of a train somewhere below the streets, the far-off sound of a car moving through rain. He brought the fresh tea back to the window and stood there for a while, looking out at the lamppost and the wet street and the small, familiar darkness of a Tuesday night in late autumn, feeling the warmth of the cup between both hands, his breath slow and even, his body resting inside the quiet. He thought about what it means to truly know the truth of something you had been wrong about, and whether the knowing always changes the shape of the thing itself, or whether sometimes the truth simply adds a new layer of meaning to what was already present, the way lamplight adds something to a street that was already real and already there before the light arrived. He thought that he had not been unhappy these 10 years, and that Shizuka, by her own honest account, had not been unhappy either, that she had arrived somewhere quiet and whole, and that this was perhaps the most important thing her letter had given him, the knowledge that 2 people who could not remain together had each found, by their own separate paths, through their own separate seasons, some version of a life worth inhabiting. He thought that it was a kindness, her writing, even arriving at this distance, even this many years late, and that kindness offered honestly is still kindness, still worth receiving, still worth being, in the simple and quiet sense of the word, grateful for. He was tired now, in the particular way one is tired after something large has moved through the body and left it lighter than it found it, the way the limbs feel after a long walk in clean autumn air, satisfied and ready for rest. He left the tea half finished on the low table by the window, turned off the lamp in the main room, and moved through the apartment in the unhurried manner of someone who knows their own home well enough to navigate it in near darkness, each step certain and familiar and requiring no thought. He lay down and drew the futon over himself, feeling its familiar weight settle across his body, the soft pressure of it, the slight smell of the room, old wood and quiet evenings, and he looked up for a moment at the ceiling, where the distant light from the street below traced the faintest of shapes, pale and wavering and barely there. He thought, as his thoughts began to slow and soften toward the edges of sleep, that somewhere on the coast, in a house near the harbor, Shizuka was probably also sleeping now, in the house she shared with her gentle, unhurried husband, and that the sea was there outside her window, dark and patient and entirely indifferent to the small important stories of the people living along its shore. He thought that he would, in the morning, sit again at the low table with his tea and her letter and decide whether to write, and that whichever direction he chose would be, in its own way, the right one, because she had not asked him for a particular outcome, only for the truth to be received with care, and it had been received, fully and quietly, on an ordinary Tuesday evening in the pale light of autumn. And so the letter rested in its cream envelope on the corner of the low table in the other room, still and complete in itself, no longer a question waiting to be opened but something else now, something that might be called a bridge, spanning the distance between what had been misunderstood and what was now, at last, understood, and under that bridge the years continued in their quiet and unhurried way, carrying everything gently, as rivers do, toward wherever things are going. And that, perhaps, is where the story rests for tonight. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting its quiet shadow settle and fade, the way a breath releases at the very end of a long, slow exhale. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one, let your shoulders drop a little further, let the weight of the day press gently into the mattress beneath you. Our next story takes us to a quieter household, a place where the rooms hold a different kind of stillness, the kind that gathers in the early morning before anyone else has stirred. We will find our way there together, slowly, without rush, following the soft thread of the next voice through the dark. The tatami room at the back of the old house smelled the way it always had, of dried rush grass and faint cedar, and something older still beneath those layers, something that belonged to many decades of quiet living pressed gently into the weave of the floor. The young man who would come to be known in this story simply as Ikki entered that room with a kind of careful slowness, pausing at the shoji threshold the way a person pauses before stepping into a body of water whose temperature remains uncertain, testing the edge before committing to the crossing. It was late afternoon in early autumn, and the light that came through the paper screens was the particular amber of that season, soft and already tilting toward the early darkness that October carries in its pockets in that part of Japan, where the mountains to the west compress the usable daylight into something precious and brief. His grandmother sat near the window, in the low chair she had used for as long as he could remember, her hands folded loosely in her lap over the fabric of a woolen cardigan, the kind of deep indigo that fades over years of washing into something gentler and more complicated than its original color. She looked up when she heard him, and her face arranged itself into the particular expression she had always kept for him, not quite a smile and not quite relief, but something that lived in the space between those two things and was warmer than either of them separately. Ikki carried within himself, on that afternoon, a weight that had no corresponding shape in the physical world, a thing he had been given 3 weeks earlier in a consulting room at a hospital in the city, where a doctor had spoken to him in measured, careful language about what the coming months would or would not hold. The phrase that had been used, a phrase about remaining time, about months rather than years, had settled over him in the days since, not with violence but with a kind of slow, pervasive heaviness, the way a rain that begins gently can soak through everything before one thinks to look for shelter. He had not told his mother, and he had not told his father, and he had not told his younger sister, who was in her first year at university and sending enthusiastic messages about her classes and her new friends, whose happiness he had been protecting the way one protects a small flame from wind, with cupped hands and careful, deliberate breath. He had come to his grandmother's house that afternoon not with any particular plan, not with a speech rehearsed or a confession prepared, but simply because there was something about that house, about the smell of the tatami and the amber of the autumn light and the familiar sound of his grandmother moving in rooms above, that had always made the world feel less urgent, less insistently present. She gestured to the cushion beside her chair without speaking, and he lowered himself onto it, crossing his legs the way he had as a child in that same room, and for a moment the present and the past existed simultaneously inside him, the child he had been and the man he now was, sitting in nearly the same posture, on what was very nearly the same cushion. His grandmother did not ask him immediately why he had come, because she had never been a person who demanded explanations before their time, and she poured tea for him from the small pot on the low table between them, the steam rising in a thin thread that caught the amber light and became briefly visible before dissolving upward into the cool air of the room. The tea was Hojica, roasted tea, the color of weak autumn sunlight, faintly smoky at the back of the throat, and it warmed his hands through the ceramic cup in a way that felt disproportionately comforting, the simple physics of heat transfer carrying with it something that could not quite be named but was deeply, bodily familiar. They spoke at first of ordinary things, the kind of conversation that exists in every family as a kind of connective tissue, a gentle accounting of recent events, who had visited whom, how the persimmons in the garden were doing that year, whether the new road being built on the other side of town would eventually extend as far as their neighborhood. His grandmother had a way of speaking that was unhurried even when the subject was trivial, as though every topic deserved the same quality of attention, a steadiness that he had always found both calming and slightly bewildering as a child, wondering how she could move through the world at that pace when everything around her seemed so much faster. "The persimmons," she said, and he listened to her voice rather than her words for a moment, noting its particular cadence, the way it rose and fell without urgency, were doing well this year. The color was good, though she was not sure she could reach the higher branches herself, and perhaps he could come back when they were fully ripe and help her with the ladder. He said that he would, and even as he said it he felt the complexity of that promise pass through him like a change in weather, the awareness that a promise made in October about November carried a different weight for him than it would have carried 1 month ago, before the consulting room, before the careful language. His grandmother seemed to be looking out the window at something beyond the garden while she spoke, or perhaps looking at nothing in particular, her gaze soft and unfocused in the way of someone who is not watching the present moment but listening instead to something interior, some quiet conversation that runs beneath the surface of all the other conversations. After a while, in the natural pause that opened between them like a small clearing in a forest after a long walk through trees, she began to speak about herself in a way that was slightly different from how she usually did, not about what she had done that week or what she planned to do, but about time, about the feeling of time. She said, in the unhurried way she said most things, that she had been thinking lately about how quickly certain things pass and how slowly others do, and how the proportion of things in those two categories seems to shift as one moves further through a life, the quick things becoming more numerous and the slow things becoming fewer but somehow more substantial. She said that she had looked at the photograph on the shelf, and she nodded toward the small framed photograph he had always known, his grandfather's face, familiar and softened by years of light, and realized that it had been many years now, more years than she sometimes thought, since she had last heard his voice. She said this without sadness, or rather with a kind of sadness that had been so long inside her that it had become part of the architecture of her life, inseparable from the rest of it, no longer painful in an acute way but present the way a scar is present, noted and acknowledged, but no longer raw. Icky held his cup of tea and listened, and found himself thinking that his grandmother was doing something he had not expected on this particular afternoon, something that felt strangely, quietly significant in a way he could not yet fully account for, the way significance often announces itself before it can be explained. She continued, looking still at the garden, at the persimmon tree whose branches were heavy with the orange weight of fruit not yet harvested, and she said that she had been thinking, lately, about how much of her own life remained ahead of her, and she said this with the same matter-of-fact steadiness with which she had spoken about the persimmons. She was, she said, not afraid, though she did not want anyone to think she was pretending to more equanimity than she actually felt, because there were moments, in the early mornings when the house was very quiet and the light was not yet decided between darkness and day, when something that might be called unease moved through her. But mostly, she said, she found that she was grateful. Grateful was the word she used, with a small pause before it as though she had considered other words and returned to this one, grateful for the length of the life she had been given, for its texture and its variety, for all the people who had passed through it. Icky, listening to his grandmother speak in that careful and unhurried way about the end of things, felt something begin to shift inside his chest, a loosening of something that had been held very tightly since the day in the consulting room, a slow movement in the place where the weight lived. He found himself thinking, as she spoke, that she was telling him something without knowing that she was telling him, or perhaps knowing very well and choosing this gentle, indirect path through the conversation rather than the direct one, the way one might choose the long path around a mountain because the view from it is kinder. He thought about how the thing that he had been carrying alone for 3 weeks, the thing that had made him feel separated from everyone he loved by a pane of glass through which he could see them clearly but through which sound did not travel in either direction, how that thing was not, in fact, without precedent in the world his grandmother inhabited. She too was holding something, he realized, with a clarity that came quietly and without fanfare, the way the light in that room had been changing all afternoon without him noticing until now, when he looked up and saw that the amber had deepened into something closer to copper, closer to the edge of evening. She too was carrying an awareness of finitude, of the finite quantity of days ahead, and she had been carrying it for longer than he had, and she had not, apparently, been destroyed by it, had not been made into someone unrecognizable by the knowledge, but remained entirely herself, folded in her indigo cardigan, watching the persimmon tree with patient eyes. He wanted to say something, felt the pressure of what he wanted to say moving upward through him, and he opened his mouth, and what came out was not the thing he had kept secret for 3 weeks, not the medical language or the time frame or any of the carefully organized facts, but something simpler and less formed, reaching before the words were fully ready. He said that he thought he understood what she meant, about the feeling of time changing its proportion, and even as he said it he knew that the words were insufficient and also that they were the best available words, the closest approximation to what he actually meant that language was currently able to offer him. His grandmother turned from the window and looked at him, and something in her expression shifted slightly, a small movement in the area around her eyes, a kind of recognition that was also a kind of question, though she did not speak the question aloud or press toward it in any way. The room was quiet around them, the way old Japanese houses are quiet in a way that city apartments are not, a quiet that has depth and texture, that seems to absorb the small sounds of the world, the faint hiss of the kettle on the kitchen counter, the distant sound of a bicycle passing on the road outside, without being disturbed by them. He looked at his hands around the ceramic cup and thought about how many times his grandmother had poured tea into hands in that room, how many conversations had taken place against the backdrop of that particular smell, how many silences had been comfortable here in the way that silences are only comfortable when you trust the other person completely and without reservation. His grandmother said, in the same quiet way she had been speaking all afternoon, that she had lived long enough to know that carrying something alone is always heavier than carrying it with someone else, even when the thing cannot be solved by the sharing, even when telling does not change any of the facts of the situation. She said this to the room, or to the garden, or to the space between them, not looking at him directly as she said it, and he understood that she was giving him the option of not responding, of letting the words simply exist in the room without requiring him to meet them directly, to walk through the door she had opened or to let it stand open and pass it by. But something in him had been moving toward this afternoon for 3 weeks, or perhaps longer, perhaps from the moment he had left the consulting room and stood on the pavement outside the hospital in the ordinary autumn air, not knowing how to begin the rest of the day with what he was now carrying. He found himself telling her, not everything, and not in the language of the consulting room, but in simpler words, the way one speaks when one is very tired and the formal structures of language have loosened, the way exhaustion sometimes clears a path through the undergrowth that effort alone cannot. He told her that he had been to see a doctor, and that the doctor had told him something that he had not yet been able to tell anyone else in his family, and he told her roughly what the contours of that thing were, the shape of it if not all of its detail, the outline without the fine interior lines. His grandmother listened without interrupting, which was entirely consistent with how she had always listened to him, from the time he was very small and came to her with the enormous and urgent problems of childhood, the misunderstandings with friends, the unfairness of certain rules at school, and she had given those problems the same quality of full, unhurried attention she gave now. When he finished speaking, the room held his words for a moment, and the light through the shoji screens had shifted again, the copper deepening now toward something closer to dusk, the persimmon tree outside becoming a silhouette against a sky that had turned the pale gray of the inside of an oyster shell. His grandmother did not say that everything would be all right, because she was not a person who said things she could not know to be true, and she did not say she was sorry in the reflexive way that people often do when confronted with news that catches them without preparation and they reach for words to fill the space. What she said, after a silence that was long enough to hold the weight of what had just been said and short enough not to become unbearable, was that she was glad he had told her, and that she meant that simply, without complication, glad in the most straightforward and complete sense of the word. She said that she thought he had been very brave, not in the way the word is sometimes used to mean stoic or unfeeling or closed, but brave in the older sense of the word, the sense that acknowledges the difficulty of the thing being done and honors that difficulty rather than diminishing it. He felt, somewhere behind his sternum, the loosening continue, and with it came something he had not anticipated, had not made space for in the week since the consulting room, a kind of sudden and total grief that arrived without warning, the way summer rain arrives in Japan, all at once and entirely, with nothing gradual about it. His eyes filled before he understood that they were going to, and then he was crying, not quietly in the way he might have cried alone, but in the full and somewhat ungainly way of a person who has held something very tightly for a very long time and has suddenly, without planning it, let it go. His grandmother moved from her chair and sat beside him on the tatami, with a slowness that was not frailty but deliberateness, lowering herself to the floor with the care of someone who respects the distance between standing and sitting, and she put her hand on his back without ceremony or fanfare. Her hand was small and light, and it moved in the same slow circle it had always moved when he was a child and had been sick or frightened or simply overwhelmed, the same gesture that had always existed at the very center of what he understood comfort to mean, carried forward intact across all the years between then and now. He could not have said how long they sat there, his grandmother on the tatami beside him, her hand moving in that slow circle, the dusk continuing its quiet work outside the shoji screens, the persimmon tree becoming fully darkness against a sky that was now the deep gray of full evening. At some point the kettle on the kitchen counter made a soft sound that suggested it was beginning to heat water again, the small domestic noise of it carrying across the quiet house like something ordinary and permanent, a sound that had existed in this house for decades and would continue to exist, indifferent to the particular gravity of this particular afternoon. His grandmother did not tell him what to feel, and she did not outline for him what the coming months should look like or who he should tell or when, because those decisions were his and she understood they were his, and she was not the kind of person who reaches uninvited for the decisions of others. What she offered, in the dusk of that October afternoon, on the tatami floor of the room that had always smelled of rush grass and cedar, was simply her presence, which had always been a kind of steadiness, a kind of quiet proof that the world continues on its ordinary axis even when extraordinary things are happening within it. He found himself thinking, as the crying subsided into something quieter and less consuming, that there was a particular mercy in being able to carry something, even briefly, with another person, and that the thing did not become smaller by the sharing but that the person carrying it became, in some measure, larger and more capable of carrying. His grandmother said, quietly, when the room had been still for a little while, that she had thought, on many evenings, about what it meant to be at the end of something, and that she had come to believe it was less like an ending in a dramatic sense and more like the last room in a long house that one has moved through slowly, over many years. She said that each room in the house had had its own light and its own smell and its own quality of air, and that one did not forget the rooms behind, they remained, all of them, in their full particularity, and that the last room was still part of the same house, connected to everything that had come before it by the same walls and the same deep foundation. Icky listened to his grandmother speak and found himself seeing something he had not been able to see in the 3 weeks since the consulting room, a way of holding the information that was different from the way he had been holding it, a different angle from which the same facts might be viewed and found to contain something other than only loss. He thought about all the rooms he had moved through in the house of his own life so far, the particular warm light of childhood in this same house, the narrow corridor of his school years, the wider and more complicated rooms of early adulthood with their high ceilings and uncertain distances, each one with its own texture and its own specific smell. He thought about the rooms yet to come, however many or few there were, and for the first time since October began those rooms felt less like an absence and more like a presence, less like the darkness at the end of a corridor and more like rooms that had not yet been entered, whose light and smell and quality of air remained to be discovered. His grandmother refilled his teacup without asking, the motion easy and practiced after so many years of the same gesture, and the steam rose again in its thin thread and caught what little light remained in the room, and she set the pot down with the small precise sound of ceramic on wood that had always been one of the sounds of that house. They talked for a while longer, moving back through conversation toward the ordinary and the immediate, the way water levels after a disturbance, not pretending the disturbance had not occurred but returning, naturally, to the surface that has always been there and will continue to be there, with or without the disturbance. She talked about his grandfather again, about something specific he used to do in autumn, a habit of walking to the small shrine at the end of the street on clear evenings to watch the last of the light leave the mountains in the west, and how she sometimes did it herself now, on the clearest evenings, finding it a kind of companionship with his memory. Icky thought about his grandfather, whom he remembered clearly and with great affection, a man of few words and very precise movements, who had taught him to fold paper cranes with the same patience his grandmother now brought to everything, and he thought that his grandfather had also, at some point, moved through the last room, and that the movement had not diminished anything that came before it. The paper cranes from those afternoons still existed somewhere, folded by 2 pairs of hands, an old man's and a child's, and the fact of their continued existence seemed to him, sitting on the tatami in the dusk, to be a kind of answer to a question he had not quite known he was asking. He sat with this understanding, which was not a comfort in the simple sense but was something more complex and more durable, something that could coexist with grief and uncertainty and the weight he still carried, without negating any of those things, without asking them to be other than they were. When he finally rose to leave, the house around him was fully dark in the way of a house without streetlights very near, and his grandmother walked him to the entrance with the small lamp she kept in the hallway for exactly this purpose, its light casting long and gentle shadows on the wooden floor. She helped him find his shoes in the darkness of the genkan, the entrance step, that small transitional space between the inside and outside of a Japanese home, where the ordinary daily ritual of shoes and slippers enacts in miniature the larger crossings one is always making, and the gesture was so familiar from childhood that it required no commentary between them. He turned at the door and looked at her in the lamplight, in her indigo cardigan that was now almost black in the low light, her face patient and known to him in every particular, and he said something that he could not have said 3 hours earlier, something that the afternoon had made possible in a way he did not yet fully understand but did not need to. He said that he was glad he had come, and that he was glad she had talked to him the way she had, and she nodded in the way she had always nodded when she received something sincerely given, not deflecting it and not inflating it, simply receiving it with the same quality of attention she gave everything else. She told him to come back for the persimmons, and the ordinariness of it, the simple domestic continuity implied by the instruction, by the assumption of a future afternoon and a ladder and fruit to be gathered together, moved through him like warmth, disproportionate to its stated content but entirely appropriate to what it was actually saying. He walked back through the neighborhood in the October dark, the air carrying the particular sharpness that comes after the warmth of autumn days has finished its work, and the streets were quiet in the way of residential neighborhoods late in the evening, occasional windows lit from within, the sound of a television somewhere, a dog's distant voice from another street. He thought, as he walked, that he would need to tell his family, eventually, and that this now felt less impossible than it had in the 3 weeks before that afternoon, as though his grandmother's listening had cleared some passage through which the words might eventually travel when they were ready to, finding their own time in the way that difficult things do. He thought about the photograph on the shelf, his grandfather's softened face, and he thought about his grandmother sitting in the low chair by the window in the evenings, watching the garden, carrying her own quiet knowledge of time and its proportion, and he felt, very gently, less alone in the carrying. The walk home took longer than it needed to, because he was not in a hurry, and because the October air was doing something pleasant against his face after the warmth of the house, and because there is a quality to the night in certain Japanese neighborhoods that rewards slow attention, the faint light of a convenience store far away, the shadow of a bicycle leaning against a fence. He thought about what his grandmother had said about the rooms of a house, the way each one holds its own light and its own smell, and he thought that the room he was in at this moment, walking through the October dark with the cold air on his face, was also a room with its own particular and irreplaceable quality, and that he was, at this moment, fully inside it. He thought about his grandmother's hand moving in that slow circle on his back, and he thought that this, perhaps, was the most fundamental thing one person could offer another, not answers, not the transformation of difficult facts into comfortable ones, but presence, steadiness, the quiet proof that another person can sit beside the hardest thing and not be undone by it. Somewhere before he reached home, he stopped for a moment under a streetlight, not for any particular reason, and looked up at the sky above the neighborhood, where a handful of stars were visible through a gap in the clouds, distant and unhurried, going about their ancient work with no particular interest in the affairs of October or of people or of anything that happens at the ordinary level of the ground. He stood there for a moment, breathing the sharp autumn air, and the weight he carried did not leave him, because it was not the kind of weight that simply leaves, but it had shifted slightly, rearranged itself into a shape that was more possible to carry, as though his grandmother's listening had been a kind of adjustment, a small but significant redistribution. He went home, and the house was lit and warm when he arrived, his family's voices audible from somewhere inside, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening that the people inside it could not yet know was anything other than ordinary, and he stood at the threshold for a moment before entering, aware of the particular quality of this specific evening, its weight and texture. He thought, in that moment at the threshold, that he would carry the afternoon with him for whatever time remained, that the smell of his grandmother's tatami room and the amber of the October light and the steam of the hojika and the slow circle of her hand would remain among the things that had mattered, in whatever accounting one makes, at the end, of what the rooms contained. And it is there, in that moment at the threshold, with the warm light of an ordinary house on his face and the October dark at his back, that the story rests tonight, while the persimmon tree in a garden not far away bears its quiet fruit in the darkness, unhurried and complete, and that, perhaps, is where we let it remain. And so we come to the end of tonight's stories. The voices have quieted now, the last thread of each tale gently set down, like a letter folded and placed on a nightstand. We hope somewhere along the way, the stories carried you away from the noise of the day, away from whatever was still turning in your mind when you first closed your eyes.